or another. Today, Exit, who's co-hosting with me, has agreed to just give us a quick update on the Black Sea grain developments in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I'll just preface this by noting that because I believe there are 2 weeks left in that initiative, we have been discussing either for our Thursday conversation or perhaps our conversation next Sunday afternoon, making it a focus on the initiative. We'll be about 1 week out. Whether we will have received announcement of a renewal of that deal by that time or not, I'm not sure, but it may be, quite a timely conversation. And so hopefully we can have a special, because I know Exit is in touch with lots of people who have deep insight on that issue. But Exit, would you be willing just to give us a quick update on where things are at the moment?
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Bond. So, Black Sea Grain Initiative, 14 days left in the initiative in the current agreement. Um, there's a lot of rhetoric back and forth from Russia and Ukraine. Um, Everybody wants to have a deal going forward. Russia says that they'd love to agree, but of course, they would like to ensure that their needs are met. In preparation for all this, I've been having a conversation with a number of different quote unquote experts in their fields. These are really smart people that I really respect. Um, and every single one of them, to a person, thinks that ships full of quote unquote Russian grain from either Crimea or Russian ports are being inspected in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I am here to tell you today that is not true. Those ships are not inspected under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. In fact, to my knowledge, those ships aren't inspected at all by anyone. That's why it's so important to have the work of people like Yorick, and a number of other people who track stolen. Yeah, up in the nest, you will see. I need you to all go home with, and that I really need you to tell other people because other people don't get it. Um, Russian ships carrying what is allegedly stolen Ukrainian grain are not inspected. We don't know specifically what's on those ships. We don't know how much there is on those ships, and that's why it's so important to have other people doing the work of tracking those ships and trying to sort that out.
Well, thank you for that. I know there are so many aspects to cover, whether it be the stolen grain that's particularly hard to track, whether the renewal will be for another 120-day period, or whether it will include other ports. Those are open questions. There was some discussion in the Tochny space just before this about what happens if Russia refuses to cooperate, and so there is just a terrific amount of interesting subject matter here. So do keep an eye out, and either Thursday or Sunday, we'll try to get some expert speakers together to join Exit and give us a more comprehensive overview of how things are developing on that front. All right, so that was the introductory material. I see Andrew has joined us, which is terrific. Andrew's one in a series of illustrious speakers that we've had drop by our space in the few weeks that we've been running. Just as a shout out, earlier we spoke with David Helms, who has been doing great work tracking weather developments and sort of hydrological matters in connection with the Kakova water reservoir. We also had a conversation with a Ukrainian-friendly logistics officer who is working outside the country to help supply Ukraine, and we got lots of insight into how somebody in his line of work, engages both with understanding what's needed in country, how to get things in and out safely. It was a really, illuminating conversation, and I'm sure that Andrew will keep that, great track record running. So, Andrew, thanks very much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So just to jump right into it, I've been following your work for a long time. And for those who may not be familiar with what Andrew does, he is, I would put him in the top 5 for mapping of developments on the front line. And he is putting out, I don't know if your updates are necessarily daily, but I know you're certainly putting out 2 or 3 a week. And so I've really appreciated your work. I'm glad that you can chat with us. I had thought maybe just starting with the basics of what inspired you to start on this work that you're doing.
Well, I have a few Ukrainian friends, and I've known them from around 2012. We started like gaming together, and it was sort of a thing where we would talk every single day, and we became pretty close friends. And then in 2014, when the war started, it was completely terrifying because some of my friends lived really close to the border, and they were pretty much immediately affected. And a few of them disappeared for a long period of time, and we were all just really scared. And it turned out okay, where they, like, one of them reappeared in London about 3 months later or whatever. So I've been following the war kind of in the background ever since then. My real career was working in baseball, so this is very different. And then when the full invasion started last year, I devoted all of my time to following the war. At first, I was doing it just for myself, and my friends told me to post it online. And then I started posting it, and people found it valuable, so I kept going.
Well, I'm sure that's a background story that a lot of the people listening can relate to. I have found it, pretty amazing, um, the specialized expertise that exists in these Twitter spaces. People who are former, they've worked in the intelligence community, and lots of folks with military backgrounds, but then many, many people who come to it just with a keen interest and, an analytical mind. And so in many ways, I find that those who have just stayed consistent at it and, attention to detail has really paid off. And so when you say that you work in baseball, did you have any analytical background, or did you work? And sometimes people who get into mapping come at it from the geographic information system, the GIS they're mappers first and then wars second, or were you completely fresh? No analytical, no mapping background.
Well, my baseball background is kind of weird because I was an analyst and a consultant, um, but the type of analysis I did was very like visual oriented, and and sort of, so it was not your typical like spreadsheet sort of baseball analysis. Like I was doing kind of like more fringe weird stuff, and uh, yeah. So I do have that sort of analytical background, although it was always more of a visual presentation sort of thing, and a lot of that was mapping, but it was different sorts of mapping. It was more
Bat
um,
angle and bat speed, like
yeah.
OPS plus and all that junk.
Yep, I studied bat angle and bat speed and launch angles and like where you can hit the ball to have the best results and how to place your defenders and that sort of stuff.
When you said analytical in baseball, I can't remember the name of the book that was done on it, but I was imagining you being one of those cold-hearted folks sitting around a table analyzing player statistics and trading them back and forth. But did it involve that as well?
Yeah, a little bit.
Sounds
I
less Red Sox Bill James and more Houston Astros launch angle.
yeah, more of the Astros, I guess. I don't know. I worked for the Mets for a little bit, and I don't know. I don't know if you want to get into a baseball rabbit hole, but I can keep going if you want, but I don't know.
Well, so toward the end of our conversation, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and there might be people like Random, my co-host here, who are right into baseball. Maybe they'll have some specific questions for you, and we'll entertain a few if they do. And so you spoke to having developed a connection with Ukraine via people that you met online. And so I'm wondering, as you're developing your updates, are you relying entirely on open sources, or are you also confirming or cross-referencing things with personal contacts that you have on the ground there?
In the beginning, I was using exclusively open sources, and as I was talking more about areas that other people weren't talking about, like the area around Avdiivka, because everybody was really focused on like Kharkiv and Kherson, like nobody really cared about Avdiivka, and so I was writing about that area, and the more I wrote about it, the more people who were fighting there would reach out to me, and then it kind of built out a network of people I know, and then they would get rotated, to other areas, and then suddenly I would have sources in other areas, and then maybe develop more sources in Avdiivka, and then they would get rotated. So it was kind of it was kind of weird. Like I met all of these people from talking about Avdiivka, and now because of that, I have a network around the country that I can talk to and reach out to. So now I use mostly human intelligence. Um, it's supplemented by, the open stuff. I read all of the open stuff, but the human intelligence is really just vastly more valuable.
Well, that's fascinating. I I know that many of us who have been following the war closely have gone through periods of intense engagement and then maybe lower engagement at times. And I know that early on I was doing some numerical presentations, and the number of people who reached out to me was surprising to me as well. I actually said to friends of mine, it actually feels like I'm running a little news service, and that most of my content was just volunteered to me, so that at some point you're not having to go out and dig for it. It's just being presented to you because you're known as like a clearinghouse for that kind of information. Does that reflect your experience as well?
Yeah, kind of. Uh, in I definitely get a lot of messages every day of people just giving me information, and but there's kind of like multiple different groups of people that I talk to, and they all kind of talk in different ways. Um, to me, the people that I get the best information from, I talk to them very, very rarely, and they might only send me like a sentence or like maybe two sentences, but the information they give is just golden. But they, you know, they might only message me like once a month, and then I have like maybe like 15 people like that where they each message me like once a month. So like maybe like every 2 or 3 days I get like one message like that. So but then there are other people who will send me stuff every day. Like for example, like they might send stuff that they think I missed, which is really helpful actually. And um, and then there's other people who just kind of like send spam, which is annoying. But you know,
And so, do you speak Ukrainian or do you speak Russian?
no, I don't.
Okay.
I'm getting a little bit better at reading it, but no, I don't speak it.
Yeah, I've heard that several people who have been following this now for a long time have actually been interested enough that they've gone off to start learning it. So I was curious. It's terrific then that having developed this network of people or sources who can give you information that they can reach out to you, you know, on your terms, presumably in English.
Well, I encourage them to speak whatever language that they want to, and then like I can get things translated. Like that's not like an issue. Like I can use, you know, like the DeepL translator, or I mean, I know enough Ukrainians who speak English that I can have things translated that way, or you know, it's not an issue translating it to me. So I just encourage them to speak whatever language they feel comfortable in. Some of them speak fluent English, so it's not an issue, and some of them don't speak any English at all, and it's also not really an issue.
Well, that's really interesting. I'll take a brief moment just to say that we will, you know, take questions for Andrew in a few minutes once we've run through a few more that I have for him. And so, if any questions occur to you, you know, keep them in mind, and I'll invite you to request the mic, and we'll bring you up to speak. If you're enjoying this conversation, please do retweet the space, as we like having as many people contribute as we can, get as many voices involved as possible. Also, just as a note, a friend of the channel is actually restreaming this on YouTube at the moment. And so it's there if you prefer to see it in visual form. Perhaps Exit would be kind enough to put a link to that YouTube channel up in the nest so that you can follow it there. We'll
I'll
keep
just,
an eye.
sorry, there's some technical difficulties at the moment, so
Okay.
unfortunately the YouTube stream is having some problems, and we'll get it up
Okay.
if we can.
Sure. Well, even if the stream isn't up now, we'll try and get a link so that once it comes back up, we will, you know, you'll be able to see the portions that we do manage to get put up there. So, Andrew, I know you said you're mainly relying on direct sources now, which is obviously um, usually more precise. As for open sources, um, which what kinds of open sources are you using? Are you relying mainly on Telegram? Do you have other methods you use? Do you, you know, did you get into some of these private groups early on? Do you use any kind of automation or keyword searching? I'm just wondering if you could describe your process.
Well, my process has changed a lot over time. Um, I used to do a lot of automated searches and getting information that way, and I did get a lot of information, especially at first, but it started getting more and more noisy over time because like I don't know, I guess like the Russians or whatever they started, or maybe even the Chinese really, but they started like inserting all garbage information for all sorts of searches, and it just became such a hassle to have to like go through it and figure out what was good and bad. Like I was spending more time like checking sources than than like doing anything else. So it just got frustrating. So I stopped doing that. Um, I am in a few chats that I have been in since like March and April, and a lot of them have been locked since then. So I'm actually really lucky to be in them. And I don't say anything. I'm just gonna like lurk. And I hope they don't kick me out. Uh, but um, I use mostly Telegram, and those chats are also on Telegram. And I there's some Twitter, but those are really my main sources. Other than talking to people.
I've heard that from several people about if they were interested in the war right at the launch of the full-scale invasion, that they got into those chats and that have been locked. And so, it's interesting to see how the accessibility has actually decreased as the war has gone on. And so there was a bit of an advantage if you were engaged quite early, which is interesting.
Yeah, there was a time right in the beginning of April, I think, where the information space just like suddenly switched. Like I really think that up until like the beginning of April, like maybe like the first week of April, um, people weren't taking the war that seriously, and then suddenly everybody started treating it very seriously, and then like kind of everything changed, and it became much more difficult to get information at that point, which it kind of made my job harder. But like I understand why they're doing it because it's like for operational security reasons and stuff. But it just made everything a lot harder in April. So if you started before April, you probably had a better time than if you started after.
You've mentioned how the information space became cluttered and you got to the point of spending all your time checking sources. I'm wondering whether when you were doing it largely on open source sources, or now that you're using more contacts, how have you set standards in terms of determining what you're going to go with as accurate enough to include in your maps? Are you cross-referencing? Do you need more than one source? I'm curious how you do that.
Well, it depends on, first, how much I trust the source, and second, how much information is coming from that area at all. Because there's some places where I just get no information, like ever. And if I get some information, I just kind of roll with it because like there's no way I can check it because there's just nobody there. Um, like especially like around like the area between like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, like I it's like a black hole to me. Like I don't know anything from there. So if I get any information, I just kind of roll with it. But then there's other areas where it's much easier to double check. Like if I know like a few different people in the same general area, and one of them tells me something, I'll I'll ask at least like a few of the others if they've heard about it. And sometimes they can just say no, that didn't happen, or other times they'll say yes, I have heard that, or sometimes they'll say I have no idea. So um, and a lot of it is just kind of if you follow everything every day, you can just see whether certain things are like even plausible, and I think that's kind of one of the biggest filters that I use is just whether something is even plausible in the first place. Like if you like if I follow like the troop movements and where people are attacking, and then like I hear something is captured in a place that nobody was there, and people weren't moving there, and nobody was attacking there. Like I just get very suspicious, and if someone is attacking a place and I know it's not going well, and then someone says it's we captured it, and I will generally believe it more. Well, I'll still try to check it, but just things like that. It's kind of mostly common sense, really. But
So
uh,
in a lot of ways, it sounds like you have moved up the expertise curve yourself, right? Just by benefit of having done it for several months.
I guess you could say that.
Yeah. I do have a few more questions for you, Andrew. But before that, I think Exit may have an update for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly note that up in the nest, you will see a link to the YouTube live stream. Thank you to Jacoby for posting that for us. And it's also down in the comment section as well, if you need to find it.
Great. Thanks very much. So, Andrew, you mentioned that you're in the Telegram chats. Are you in touch with any of the other mappers here on Twitter? Do you guys compare notes if you have, uncertainty in a different region, or maybe you're not in direct touch, but do you kind of monitor their work to see if your information is matching up?
I do talk to a few of them. I try not to compare notes too much. Like we sometimes we'll talk about things we'll say I've heard this. Have you heard this? Or something like that. But I don't really like to compare to them too much because then you kind of welcome a echo chamber type thing where it can just kind of like spiral out of control and don't really want that. There, this is kind of getting in. Anyway, there are some areas where I know more information than I can let out, and then if I see like a general consensus of this area, well, a certain fraction of that information has been released, I'll also cover that fraction of information and not. I don't, anyway, I hope you understand what I mean.
Totally understand. Yep. So have you ever made a mistake that you kind of regret, or have they been more along the lines of it's contested, maybe you were a little too early, but is there anything maybe you would take back?
Yeah, there was one really embarrassing mistake. And there was I was just at the end of the day and I was really tired. And there was this sudden um, story from a certain person, anyway, about a Ukrainian breakthrough. And I didn't really have time to check it. I was tired. I just drew it on my map, and it was completely wrong. And it was just really embarrassing. Like I felt really stupid doing that. But I
Well,
mean, I've made a number of mistakes. I can't. That one. It was near Kherson. Um, in the beginning of like the Ukrainian offensive. Anyway, so I've made other mistakes too, but that one really sticks out. I think most of the mistakes I've made are reasonable, or like just I don't know, just I don't have perfect information, so I don't really hold it against myself too much. I don't know. Like I never claimed to be perfect. So like the little changes, like the little things here and there, are not super big, but that one breakthrough was like a really big mistake. uh,
yeah, I will admit that, I'm sure fatigue for people who, may be doing this as a side project, if you're investing many hours in checking sources or, trying to be as accurate as possible, fatigue is definitely a real thing that comes into, oh, do I have to do all the regular checks, for this one? And that's when something slips through. So I totally understand that. Um, I'm curious then, I don't know if it would be in connection with an error, but how do you have you dealt with very much in the way of criticism or trolls? Like, has that been a problem you've had to deal with?
oh yeah, especially our friend. I'm even gonna say his name. Um, that one guy that everybody knows. I don't, but he's obnoxious, and he's not. It's not so much him; it's his followers that are obnoxious, and but yeah, yeah, I deal with trolls on a fairly regular basis, and the people who like message like lots of hate. And sometimes I post screenshots of those messages. Um, that they're all mostly the same though. They all say basically the same thing. Um, and like in the beginning, I got attacked a lot. They were like, "Go back to baseball," because it was really funny. Like it was these like Russian people who don't know anything about baseball telling me to go back to baseball. So that was kind of funny. But I don't know. I think everyone has dealt with it, and I don't think it's any different for me than for anybody else. It's not that bad either. It's easy to filter out. In fact, Twitter itself does a pretty good job auto filtering, so I don't even see most of it. Like I have to actively look for it sometimes, which I don't do very often. But yeah, it happens, but it's not a big deal.
It's interesting that the way you describe it makes it sound like early on it might have been either Russian or pro-Russian folks who were giving you more of a hard time, but then it maybe transitioned to armchair experts. Would that be a fair way to describe it?
Well, it's still pro-Russian people, and it's funny is like the worst ones are from like Brazil, and I guess Serbia, and I'll leave it at
that. Just before continuing, just to check if Exit has an update. Go ahead.
I don't have an update, and I can hold my questions for a minute later.
I appreciate those who have questions just being patient. I do have maybe 2 or 3 more questions for Andrew I had lined up. So
Hey, Michael, can I ask you to check your audio, please?
Yeah, hey, Michael, you're having some audio difficulties, just a heads up.
Is it any better now?
No.
Okay. Exit, would you like to go ahead? I'll try and resolve it.
You bet. I just noted, Andrew, as you were talking, I follow the Black Sea Grain Initiative and spend time every day updating ships and where they are and where they're going and all of those things. And I'm thankful that I don't do that by myself, because if I did, I don't know how I would survive. But I noted how much your process seems very similar to mine, and I really wanted to commend you on sticking with it for as long as you have, because as you noted, at the end of a very long day, when you're tired and you just want to get your update out so that everybody gets the information that they're expecting, it's really hard to not just throw something in that you're pretty sure on, like really sure on. It's normally always from a really great person. And maybe you don't ask the one question that you should have asked or things like that. I know I definitely have had those exact same opportunities come up, and I have absolutely had things that I needed to be corrected on too. And I'm always really thankful that there are others out there who are willing to make that correction and help with the information. And so I just really wanted to commend you on that. You talked about the criticism of trolls specifically. Is there anything from that criticism that you've kind of taken away and changed your process as to maybe things that you do better or differently now? Like, has that criticism ever been helpful to you?
Yeah, some of the criticism is helpful. I've taken so the main thing that I found useful was that I was posting things that were too too pro-Ukrainian, and not really being critical enough about it, because there I don't really know how to say it. I've never actually really put this idea in the words before, but there were certain things that were too pro-Ukrainian, and it needed to be filtered and digested first before being talked about. And I would just post the original thing or like repost it and or post like a screenshot or whatever, and not really think much of it. And then I would get criticisms from trolls, mostly very hateful trolls, that it shouldn't be taken at face value. And I think they were mostly right, that it shouldn't be taken at face value. But I was leaving that to the reader to not take it at face value. but I think it's a fair criticism that it shouldn't even be reposted at face value. That it should be, um, looked at critically and then maybe rephrased or whatever before being posted. And I think that's a valid criticism. And then I've taken that to heart, and I really think about that a lot now. Um, even though I don't always follow that advice, but I do think about it a lot. So.
Yeah, I think avoiding having rose-tinted glasses is a pretty good thing to watch out for when it comes to your, like, you want to have, like, in the intelligence field, you want to have an accurate basis, and not everything's going to be good news. And so I think when it comes to that spaces, you have to manage things and expectations a lot, especially when it's on the side that you more agree with than the other. But just on my standpoint, Andrew, why Brazil?
Dude, I have no idea. They just, not all Brazilians, obviously, but the Brazilians who support Russia are just, they're just really into it. They're really vocal and very hateful, and somehow it always comes back to the Jews. I, I don't really understand, but yeah, it's like in a lot of that.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to echo Random's comments. I know that specifically, I often in the things that I cover, I'm just like you that there's things that are really important to point out that aren't necessarily pro-Ukrainian. I have spent a lot of time talking about their efforts in the corruption area. And while that is more of a pro-Ukrainian story than I think some people realize, it also sometimes attracts a lot of trolls and um, will get you comments about Ukraine having a lot of corruption and all of these other storylines that are out there. And I just, yeah, it's not always easy to tell the truth, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, compared to what people want to hear, I guess. Um, I think we'll run some hands for a second while Mr. Bond is trying to sort his problems out with his mic. And I think, Aaron, you were the first one up. So do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, Aaron Bowma here, host of the Bauma Report and OSINT Space, military analyst and all that. So I wanted to ask you, it's good to see you again. I wanted to ask you, so you're using more human intelligence. What do you still use? I mean, there's so many vast aspects to signals intelligence, like, I mean, versus Twitter versus, Telegram and all those, and then of course different aspects coming from the field and not. Do you still, I mean, I assume you still use, signals intelligence in other ways, or is it more only now human intelligence? Because I remember hearing you say that mainly you use human intelligence, and so yeah. Good to see you, my friend.
Signal intelligence is hard for me because I don't really speak Russian or Ukrainian. I mean, I know people who do signal intelligence, like actual like signal intelligence, and rarely, very rarely, but I do get some information from them. Usually they can't talk about it, obviously, but sometimes. And I don't only use human intelligence. It's just that the human intelligence is so vastly more valuable than the other things that, um, like, if you look at like the amount of information I consume, it's probably like 95% OSINT. Um, but if you go by like the value of the information, it's probably like 75% human. So it's I do read a lot every day. I usually wake up in the morning because I'm like 8 hours behind Ukraine or whatever. I wake up in the morning with like 20 or 30,000 messages to read, and some of them are like multiple pages long. It's kind of exhausting, and then during or after that, I might have a few like 2, 3, 5 minute conversations with a few people. Um, and those kind of those like 10 minutes of talking to people is kind of more valuable than all of the stuff I read combined, which is it kind of makes it feel more exhausting, but it's just the way it works out. And but I do a lot of reading as well.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. ID 10 Tango, go ahead.
Well, firstly, my professional history would argue with your assumption that human intelligence is more valuable than SIGINT, but I will give you a pass for being OSINT. Doing a great job. My question is, do you have any reservations or do you hold back any data for the possible fear of it being actionable intelligence to one side or another prior to disseminating that information?
Yeah, I hold back a lot, and that's really kind of the hardest part of everything, is knowing what to hold back and how long to hold it back, and if I should ever release it. There's I mean, there's stuff that I've never talked about. So uh, that yeah, there's a lot I hold back.
Would you say that part of the reason that you have so much human intelligence is like coming towards you is specifically because you work to be trustworthy with that and useful with the information that you actually put forward?
Maybe. I mean, I can't speak for them. I know that if you make one mistake, it can ruin everything. So, I have made mistakes before, and it didn't end well. But I I generally try to be professional, and more importantly, I respect them a lot, and I don't want them to be in physical danger. Is really kind of the more driving force.
No pressure though, hey? Um, I have a few more questions from Mr. Bond, so if you don't mind, I will continue on some of those. Mr. Bond, did you want to test your mic quick? Maybe not. I saw it click there for a second. Do you make limited predictions at all? We know obviously Bakhmut is a big going concern at the moment. Um, do you have like a feeling on what's likely to happen there? Do you is there feelings specifically about the broader war in general that you like to put out there, or are those things that you keep to yourself? How do you deal with what you see coming and how much of that you let out?
Yeah, I make predictions. Like I make predictions quite often. I probably make more than I should, but I uh, I don't know. I don't know what to say. But yeah, I do make predictions. Do you want me to make a prediction of Bakhmut?
I would love to hear your prediction of Bakhmut because I don't have one, and any educated opinion is better than
Okay.
mine.
Well, I think Ukraine is going to slowly, over time, and then probably suddenly at some point, but
their positions we'll know because we were there. They're again obfuscated when it comes to explaining what we just did. And along the lines between the aid workers I know doing it and people who are fighting it, there's a lot of information that shows that the Russians are bogged down there. I think if they get right there, they basically cut off a joint at M06, it's a highway that runs from Kiev down to Donetsk. And it really has been impassable for a while anyway. The effort to bifurcate the Russian forces elsewhere will be useful to see, so I'll be watching what you have to say there. The sort of rhetorical question on the table is a way to teach anyone who's interested out in the field how to how do I want to say it without OPSEC considered. How do some of you have methodology that those who are into OSINT can get better at what they're doing for accuracy, if that makes sense? So instead of these sort of football throws based on a few bits of understanding, they can actually learn a way to keep track of the data that's coming in. How do you do it? Like I pay attention to a lot of exits work, so I've just seen her do it for a year now. There are some people that I know how they do certain geolocation work, and I have my own way of doing it. So even for people who are doing this work, OSINT only, not the human side, maybe. If you guys have time to discuss that at some point, that'd be good.
So maybe I'll piggyback on that question and ask you, Andrew, there's possibly a coming Ukrainian offensive that we've been talking about for weeks. And in the last couple spaces, MrBond has been talking about kind of developing a list of things that we should be watching in order to know that this Ukrainian offensive is starting or how it's progressing. Is there some really specific things that you are concentrating on when it comes to that?
Well, you might not like my answer, but I really don't think there's going to be a Ukrainian offensive. I think, personally, I think the offensive is a way to keep people's morale up right now, because right now I think is really kind of the worst of the war, and I think this will go on throughout most of the summer, or this is kind of the low point, and then after this I think there will be kind of an uphill climb towards the end of the war. But I don't know, I'm not convinced there will be an offensive from Ukraine right now. I think their main goal is attrition, and there may be a point where the attrition might go better than they expect, and there could be an attack at that point. But I don't think we're there yet, personally. There's a lot of the Russian defenses are deep. They're multiple levels, layers of defenses all over Ukraine, and they might be manned by mobilized little people, but it doesn't take much to stand there in a little trench and have your artillery shoot, and then maybe have some helicopters fly over and shoot some rockets or whatever. So it doesn't take super highly skilled troops to pull that off and to slow down a Ukrainian attack. So, and especially over a lot of this ground is just really difficult to cross. It's very dangerous to cross. So it could lead to pretty high casualties for a Ukrainian attack. So I'm not convinced there will be an offensive. I think if there will be an offensive, and there will be at some point, I just don't think it will be soon. But I think the first thing you'll see whether it's obvious or not, will be Russia relocating their increasingly larger numbers of troops out of one location into another, which is kind of what we saw in Kherson, where they pulled guys from all over Ukraine and pushed them towards Kherson. Whether they ever reached it or not is another story. Like some of them went to Melitopol or whatever, but they're all moving towards Kherson. So that left, Kharkiv weak, and then there was the Kharkiv attack. So I think we'll see that sort of thing going on, where they increasingly move guys to one location, which we're sort of seeing now. We're seeing them move guys towards Vuhledar and obviously Bakhmut. But it's not to this sort of extreme that I think would allow for a Ukrainian attack. Like, I think they're moving some guys from Kremena towards Vuhledar, from what I understand. But they still have enough guys in Kremena to defend it. They're just moving some away. So, and the same is sort of true for Zaporizhia, where they are moving guys out of it apparently and moving it maybe towards Vuhledar as well or whatever. But there's still enough guys there still to defend it. So I think that would be the thing to look for, the increasing troop movements. But I don't think we're there yet.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on where we're headed, because I think you obviously have a much better educated opinion than some of us in the audience here. Allsource, did you want to go ahead?
Hey, I'm actually going to defer to John because I saw he was waving his hand while Andrew was speaking, so I'll let John speak. I think he had a more pressing issue.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much. Just a quick thing. The Russian relocations to Kherson, I was just going to say, that was a reaction to openly stated Ukrainian stratagems that were now known to be diversionary. So I think, and another big thing to note would be that the Russian, like this massive relocation to Kherson was kind of like where the line was the weakest, and that was like where we're seeing and anybody can challenge me on this. This is more of an opinion of mine, that they were using these initial mobilized forces to kind of stabilize the line as a whole, and Kherson was kind of the first place where they needed to go. I think that's where you would see it. I think the line is majority now stabilized, and now you're kind of seeing them harden this defense, and they're starting to build this defense in depth. Multiple lines of defense. I just don't think we're going to see that type of like Russian reaction again. I think the Russians they're not very good at looking when it comes to learning, and so they kind of, and I think by the fact that the Ukrainians are still plastering this idea of a Kherson offensive all over the airwaves, and we're not seeing that Russian reaction because, well, one, the Russian, the force is already there. That two, with the job of repelling a Ukrainian offensive. The only thing I would disagree with is that that high casualties would be the thing that would stop the Ukrainians from trying to prosecute an offensive. I think when you're doing any type of offensive operation, high casualties are something that you're gonna expect, and you're gonna know that you're gonna have to eat those casualties. The 1991 Gulf War is a perfect example. We were expecting mass casualties. It's thankful to God that it didn't happen. But we were expecting mass casualties. We were expecting the Iraqis to fight back hard because we knew they had this supposed defense in depth, and we thought if we were going to hit them hard, they're going to hit back hard. They didn't hit back as hard as we thought they would, which is kind of a blessing. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Not entirely a question, but we'll take it. Allsource, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question for Andrew because it's something that a lot of the accounts here we discussed internally, and I'd like your feedback. So the first one is, I think it's fairly obvious that this offensive we're seeing right now across the Donbass is really the whole vaunted second Russian offensive. They really don't have the capabilities to do much more than this. And so from your perspective, what would you consider is the main effort for the Russians in this offensive? Would you consider it to be the Caesar Bakhmut? Do you think it's Volodar? And so that's number one. And then number two, we saw this Wall Street Journal reporting that kind of indicated that one of the issues that the Ukrainians were running into is that although the Russians suffered significantly more casualties than the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, that the Ukrainians suffered more ready forces, more highly trained forces compared to what, especially Wagner and their prisoners. And so that the Wagners were more expendable, while the Ukrainian military that was there, the Ukrainian military forces that were there, were probably more trained and prepared, and that sacrifices combat power for an eventual, second offensive, whenever it happens. I know we're talking about spring, summer, etc. So I just like your opinion on those two questions and see where you're at, so we, just inform kind of our discussions as well. Thanks.
All right. Well, the first, I think they're attacking. I think their main goal. I really think their goal is to capture at least one full oblast, if not both, Luhansk and Donetsk. So I think their attack on Volodar was really a response to their failure in Marinka and Novelski. They really want to get behind Marinka and push west, and they have failed in every attempt from every angle. There's Novomykolaivka and Novelski and Pervomaisky and Marinka itself. They haven't really attacked Krasnohorivka, but they might at some point. I think they've been waiting to capture Novelski first. So they've been trying to get behind Marinka and move west to Krakove or whatever. So I think getting beyond Marinka was one of their major tasks, which they have totally failed. And their other task was to break the Bakhmut line and push towards Kramatorsk, which has been more successful, but only marginally, in that they will likely capture Bakhmut at this point. But that hasn't gotten them any closer to Kramatorsk. They're like what, 10 kilometers closer now than they were like 10 months ago. So it's been a failure on both fronts. So I think that those were their two main tasks. And regarding the casualties, I agree. Ukraine has lost a lot of their more experienced people. And I think to a certain extent, this will come down to whether Ukraine is capable of training a new cohort. Ukraine was never going to win the war with just that original cohort of troops. They couldn't rely on just, like 3 brigades or whatever, and not even the full brigade, just like a few battalions in each of those 3 brigades. That you can't win a war with just that. It was unrealistic to begin with. They need better training. They need to produce higher quality soldiers, and they need that is a need. That is a major problem in the Ukrainian army. It has been since 2014, and it's something they need to address. And then if they want to win the war, this is something they're going to have to address at some point, hopefully soon. Although, they are having training in other countries now, and NATO is helping train, which is good, I guess. But I don't think it's enough. I think Ukraine has to do training itself, and that's a cultural problem within the military and within the higher levels of leadership in Zelensky's government, and they need to fix it. It's kind of that simple.
So this has been a terrific conversation. I'm just coming in for an audio test. Am I coming through?
Yep.
You are.
That's terrific. I switched to my backup mic, so guys, sorry about that. And huge thanks to my co-hosts for carrying the show for a few minutes there. Random, you had your hand up. Did you want to come in with a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back a bit. A couple questions for Andrew, a couple of questions for Andrew in the room. I guess to circle back to the conversation we were having with both Chris and mentioning and stuff, is that how have you navigated the challenges of OPSEC when it comes to dealing with your human human intelligence sources and doing the open source intelligence as this has gone on. How have you been able to navigate through different Telegram channels and those operational aspects when it comes to trying to sift through what is and what isn't actual data and confirming that and collaborating that? Also, what do you make, and this is more for the room and in yourself, what do you guys make of the situation going on where you have recently airstrikes or strikes into Russia across around Kursk, and the issue with Sumy Oblast and the possibility of something going on in the north? I know they set up a field hospital near Sumy Oblast. They've been shelling Sumy Oblast for what seems like months now. Do you guys see anything happening in that regard to that? Also, the question of Russian air power and how it plays out. I have a question. I pay more attention to the VKS in some regards, in some respects, but also, just on a personal note, where have you been hiding Language Learner? Is he like locked up in a bullpen in like City Field, or like where's he been?
He knows what he did. But the answer to some of your questions, how I manage the human thing is, part of it is trying to develop like a personal relationship with someone, so that there is like an understanding of where I'm coming from and where they're coming from, so that we can communicate more effectively. Like the worst thing that can happen is if someone that I don't really know that well messages me something, and that's kind of when things go wrong. Where it's a lot better if we talk about things. Usually the things we talk about are dogs and cats, and because that's a thing that we all have in common. We share pictures of animals, and so we kind of develop a human relationship, and that makes it a little bit easier. So when they tell me something, I can, lean on that relationship to understand like how, just where it's coming from. So whether it's something I can talk about, whether it's something I, just to keep in the back of my mind, whether they, sometimes they actively want me to share things, and they say, please tell everybody this thing. So, and then that gets into another can of worms. So like, why they want me to tell people? And then, anyway, so that's another problem. And I can't remember your other questions. Tell me again.
Yeah, it's all right. That's what happens when the trying to solve the mystery of what the heck happened to Language. But but apparently he knows what he did. The question I had was, and this was for the room as much as you, is what do you make in regards to the stuff coming out of the north in Ukraine? Because obviously we pay a lot of attention to Avdiivka and Bakhmut and Volodar, but there's a lot of rumblings. Like I've been seeing like the shelling of Sumy Oblast in the north for quite some time. The reports of setting up a field hospital across the border, and then the cross strikes going on by the Ukrainians at Kursk and other areas and forward operating bases in that regard. Do you think there's something going on in the north, or is that just noise?
I think it's just noise, and I think most of that shelling, they're trying to train new crew, I believe. And a lot of that shelling, it's like, if you dig a little bit deeper into it, like it's like 3 mortar shells or like 2 artillery shells. Like that's the sort of shelling. So it's not like a super big deal. It just seems that like I don't know. It just seems like they're drilling people. Like here, fire 2 shells at that town and see how close you get, or something. Like I think that's kind of what's happening. I don't think they're preparing an offensive there. I think partly they're scared to attack there. I think it would go very, very badly. I don't think they really have the logistics to do such an attack. I don't think they have the leadership. I don't think they have the commanders necessary to pull that attack off. And also the troops that they have there are really garbage quality. They're like the lowest of the low. They are like the replacement guys. They're like bottom of the barrel. I don't think there'll be an attack there.
Okay, so they're the high level A team of Palm Beach, in the Wilpon management system. Then, all source. I saw your hand shoot up, so I figure we're gonna get a Chernahiv reference. Go ahead, and then we'll go to NatSec and then my co-host.
Yeah, no, I think, and maybe Andrew, by all means, if you disagree with me, please chime in. I just think like when we're looking at Russia's offensive into Ukraine, like what we're seeing right now in the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, like this is really it. I mean, I don't think Russia has the logistics and command control, even combat power to expand further than what they're doing now. I think if you look at kind of the offensive operations that they're executing right now, it's very, very, very basic, and it consists of artillery galore and then uncoordinated offensive operations, either through armor only or infantry human waves. So you can go down through logistics, command and control, manpower, equipment. You know, I just don't see Russia having the military capability at this point to really do more other types of offensive in other parts of Ukraine. And then the other issue, and I think Andrew kind of really hit this previously, is one of the other things we're seeing Russia lacking severely is the ability to do what we, exploit success, right? So right now it looks like Bakhmut is going to fall. The writing's on the wall, but I don't think anybody here has any serious belief that Russia will have the ability to exploit success and push further forward, as Andrew said, with 10 kilometers in 10 months, right? And I think that is indicative of that Russia cannot do what we, let's say, saw Ukraine do in Kharkiv, where they exploited success in the counteroffensive and rapidly were able to, through speed and firepower against a poorly defended area, exploit and achieve, fairly significant success. We just haven't seen Russia really do that since the beginning of this invasion.
You didn't mean to make that a rhyme, right?
One thing I want to say, the commanders, the Russian commanders around Kupiansk, I've heard that they are very, very good, and I don't know how much he controls. I don't really know his rank. He might be like a colonel or something. I don't know, but I've heard that those guys that are very close to Kupiansk, like north of it, near like the Richna, I've heard that commander is very, very talented.
So, and I think just if I may, and let me be a little bit more specific. I think the only real areas where we've seen Russia, and I think this kind of, you can look at 2014, is that at most what we see the Russians have success at the command and control area, and commanders is really at the regimental, right? At most, right? At the regimental, we would consider in the U.S. military NATO brigade, right? That ability to command and control at that echelon, I think, is the max that we've seen Russia really execute combined armor operations. Once you start going at higher echelons and starting to incorporate multiple regiments or divisions, I think that's when you kind of just see a generic breakdown or just very simplistic operations. I think the regimental and below, you can probably find good examples of Russian commanders on the field. And I think that's at most what they're able to do, because when you see their offensive operations, you're not seeing really what we would consider mass and effectiveness, combat power to achieve objectives. Economy of force, that's the term I'm looking for, right? You're trying to achieve mass and economy of force, and we're just not seeing that at echelons above regiment.
I always appreciate your inside all source. I just want to check in with Andrew because we had talked about maybe a 45-minute chat, and we're now over an hour. Andrew, are you okay to take a few more questions?
Yeah, it's fine. I wasn't doing anything anyway. It's fine.
Okay. Hopefully we don't make your update come in late tonight. I'm going to go to Exit as co-host prerogative. Then we'll go to National Security and then John. Go ahead, Exit.
And actually, my question is from the audience, a dear friend in the audience. How far off is Raybar's reality in their maps compared to the information that you get?
I honestly, I haven't read them in a long time, so I really don't know. I do know that when they threatened to throw him in prison, he kind of went into like lockstep with the Russian propaganda. Before they threatened to throw him in prison, I think he was higher quality. After they threatened him, I read his stuff for maybe 2 more weeks and then gave up because it was kind of pointless. Occasionally, I will just like skim through their feed. I think like the most value I find from them is when they like have a geolocated video and sometimes it's a video that I haven't located yet, but or maybe one I haven't seen yet. But beyond that, I really don't pay attention to them because it's just pointless. He was always propaganda, but then he just went like hard line propaganda when they threatened him. So I just kind of don't pay attention.
It's an interesting question, though, especially, you know, he went hardline, but they threatened him, but at the same time, they also gave him a TV show. So I guess he, you know, the carrots and the sticks. National security, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, so I'll piggyback on that in a couple of things. There'll be there's been a few things discussed, so I'll lay them out. I'll pick up on that immediately, though. So that's what I see with that channel, and what I do is harvest a whole lot of Telegram content on multiple sides. I harvest it first, and then I go through it later when I feel like a certain mood. I want to put up with certain bullshit, and that's one that has been interesting to watch. I kind of make pinpoints also of things that seem to be fairly affirmative information on all sides, and another point of view on it. So I'll segue into another part that you were talking about from there, which is a degradation in the institutional memory of the leadership. For instance, you know, in the first month, massive VDV forces were taken out. That's gone. There were a lot of elite forces that have been killed elsewhere. We had generals after general falling at the beginning. Changes that you've seen in the last year there. Any thoughts on that? Thanks. Oh, also one more thing. The Prigozhin-Shoigu optics, when it comes to some of the videos that have been coming out lately. Shoigu going down towards the front, and then Prigozhin being far more bold to go straight on television with hostage video earlier this week, and then within the last 48 hours, hey, we don't have any ammunition. This will go down in history as a loss, et cetera, et cetera. Thoughts on those things? Thanks.
Well, regarding the degradation, it's hard for me to analyze because I wasn't really a Russian expert before this. I read a bunch of books, but that was about it. But you see, like in Vuhledar, when they sent their 155th into Vuhledar to attack, and the majority of that force were mobilized, and they all pretty much got massacred. And then their true forces, like whatever professionals they have left over, a lot of them refused to fight reportedly, and then I think they were ultimately withdrawn. And then right now in the north around Kharkiv, I think what it is, the 4th Guards Army. I think that's what it is, and like the 2nd Motorized Division or whatever they're called. Those are like two of the best forces Russia had, or at least on paper, before the war, and now they're considered garbage. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on the degradation of their forces, but you see, when you tell me that one of the best forces that Russia supposedly had in their military is now sitting in guard duty on the Kharkiv border, occasionally shooting mortars, it tells me that they've had a lot of degradation. What was the other question? I forgot.
When you were talking about some of the videos and the hard propaganda, you know,
Yeah, I remember. Prigozhin.
Prigozhin Shoigu.
I don't know what to make of the ammo shortage thing, because I don't think it's actually true. In fact, I don't know. Everyone I've talked to who is high enough ranked to know this sort of thing, at least they should know. They've all told me that there's no shortage of ammo. Like the Ukrainians are saying that Wagner has no shortage of ammo. So I tend to believe that all of these stories are completely fake. And then it makes me wonder, why would they say this if it's fake? And then there are the other stories that they've been banned from recruiting, or at least recruiting certain types of prisoners or whatever. So And I don't actually know if that's true or not either. So it makes me wonder, why would he be saying these things if neither of those things are true, or if one of them isn't true? So I think that this is a story that is designed for the Russian people, to make them support Wagner more. I think that is his purpose. Is that I think he wants more political power within Russia. I don't
Yeah,
think.
I think that's exactly the read. Yeah, because he basically in the specific words he used in this latest video, that's what he said. It essentially was supporting Wagner is the way in which this will win, and we are the mortar. That was a term that really stuck in there. We are the mortar of this fight, and if you don't give us what we want, which is basically sort of like not even saying, "Hey, fight for our forces," it's give me some money. It was like right there, the whole tagline, but the rest was like, oh, hey, like we lose, it's on you. And this battle he's had with the general forces leadership has been, fairly cutthroat lately. It was actually, I've been making a prediction for months that there's going to be a bullet in his head at some point when the pit bull style has to go down. But the more he keeps doing this, I had to go, well, I don't know if they have who has the strength on the trigger to pull it yet, Anyway, thank you, man. Good work, by the way.
Thanks very much for your question. We'll go to Phil, and then maybe I'll ask Andrew a last question, and then we'll release him. He's been very game to go with the audience questions. Go ahead, Phil.
Is it baseball related though?
My question's not baseball related, but thank you, Michael, for the space. Really interesting, and thanks, Andrew, for joining. I also watch your Twitches, which have been incredibly useful. You and Constantine do an amazing job. The question I have is about 2 weeks ago, you kept mentioning about being worried about the Kremina area because there was a 7-to-1 to 10-to-1 Russian troop to Ukrainian troop ratio. But there's evidence now that those troops have been rearranged on the battlefront. And my question is, we had 200,000 in the initial invasion, plus another, 300,000 mobilized Russians. And Helios Runner has mentioned that they have 100 several times, although he didn't source it, he's been fairly accurate. He said that they have 100,000 troops around Bakhmut, whether you can, whether they're Wagner or Russian soldiers or mobilized, whatever they are, there's 100,000 there. I'm just wondering, how many troops are at each front, like Zaporizhia, which nothing's happening? Is it empty, how the Kharkiv front was, before the Kharkiv offensive? And same thing with Kherson. How is that troop arrangement? Has it gone down in the Kremina area from that 7-to-1 to 10-to-1 ratio? Have you seen any kind of movement in the troop concentrations? And thanks again for what you do.
Regarding Kremina, Ukraine sent reinforcements there, and I think around a week after that those reinforcements arrived, the whole area kind of died, and then now you see Russia kind of withdrawing people. So I think what happened there was that Ukraine saw that they were in a bad spot. They sent guys there. They got the force ratio that they wanted, and Russia saw this force ratio and said it's not worth it anymore and sent the guys somewhere else. I think that's pretty much what happened. I don't know how much. I don't really want to get into more detail than that because I don't know how much of it is public information or whatever. But what was your other question? I forgot.
Oh, no worries. That was a long question, so my apologies. What along the Zaporizhia front and the Kherson front that are pretty stagnant, have you noticed any differences, or how many troops are even there?
From what I understand, Ukraine is more or less keeping enough forces there to keep the defensive ratio that they want. So as Russia withdraws their forces, Ukraine will withdraw, and as Russia builds up, Ukraine will build up, and they're trying to keep their force ratios. Um, beyond that, there are really not as many people in Zaporizhia as there could be, mostly because there's kind of no point. Attacking there on either side is like kind of suicidal because it's much easier to defend that area than to attack, especially without air power. So neither side really has the motivation to do much beyond those like suicide attacks that Russia did a few weeks ago. Russia has been building increasingly more defenses there. Ukraine has already built tons of defenses there. They basically spent a year building that, or like 8 months or whatever. So you see a lot more forces around Volodar and around the whole Donbass front, especially Marinka has I don't know how many guys are in every spot. I've heard that, and this might be kind of dated at this point. I heard that Russia had around 30,000 men in reserve in Donetsk city. So that reserve force would presumably be for Marinka and Avdiivka, and maybe even Volodar. Not really sure. Beyond that, we've heard that they had like 10,000 guys around the Kharkiv northern area, but how many are in every individual spot? I'm not really sure. That's kind of like beyond what I track, because that's like a whole different can of worms, like tracking that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, I just know that Zaporizhia in particular is kind of where Ukraine and Russia are both kind of putting all the worst troops there, and kind of all the worst commanders too. They just go like, so there's not so much going on there. A lot of the troops kind of get, I think, rotated there to get combat experience from. I think I'm not totally sure about that. So.
Well, thanks very much for that question, Phil, and your answer, Andrew. I'll take my shot with one last question. It's coming back more to your work process, and this is partly to set you up to plug you. So you've been doing your presentations on Twitch, and the videos you then post on your YouTube channel. And so for those listening, if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to follow Andrew here on Twitter. Up in the nest, there are links to his Twitch channel, which is Ukraine Battlefield Updates, I believe. And then if you scroll one back, there's a link to his YouTube channel. So whichever platform you prefer to consume, your news on, or maybe on all of them, go and follow Andrew. And, given that you've decided to use Twitch, why did you pick that? Are you happy with it? And have you considered distribution on any other platforms? I know some people in these Twitter spaces, like John Spencer, also are on TikTok. Why Twitch? And have you considered anything else?
Well, I wanted to diversify away from Twitter. So that was my main motivation. So that ruled out spaces. I was kind of 50-50 on YouTube versus Twitch. And then it turned out that it took a long time to set up to just to have a stream. So we just decided one day we're going to stream today. Like, this is the day. And it turned out that in order to stream on YouTube, you had to wait 24 hours. So we said, I guess that rules out YouTube. So we did Twitch. But I still post the videos to YouTube afterwards. So it's not a big deal. But yeah, that's why we picked Twitch. I'm not really married to Twitch. I mean, it could switch at some point. It's not a big deal. If I feel like going to YouTube, then we'll go to YouTube. Or if we feel like something else, do something else. As for posting short content, I'm just really bad at posting short content. So like, I can't really do like like TikTok, because like you need like a 5-minute limit. Like I can't talk in 5 minutes, so it's not a skill I have. So yeah, we do Twitch.
You know, it's very interesting that you went really just to diversify away from Twitter. I thought potentially it might have been an approach to try to appeal to a different crowd. You know what I mean? As in the sorts of people you would reach via Twitch or YouTube would just be different than here on Twitter. So I imagine that that's a side benefit as well. But in any event, Andrew, I don't want to hold you anymore. I had hoped we would have, give you an easy first interview appearing on our space. The audience was happy to grill you a little bit more than I expected, but in my opinion, it's been a great conversation. Hopefully you've enjoyed it enough that you might consider coming back and chatting with us again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to stay as long as you want me to. It makes no difference to me.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you.
Just to come back full circle, Andrew, real quick, you think Twitch was an easier choice because of the gaming experience, the community that got you started in the OSINT space in the first place, in some way, weird way?
I guess sort of, because I already had a Twitch account, but it was just a joke account. But it was really literally just because you had to wait 24 hours to stream on YouTube.
Yeah, that'll get you. But no, the other thing is there was that news from like last month or so that Wagner recruited like Russia's best Hearts of Iron 4 player. So if we ever need to get together and combat Vatniks in the gaming space, we know who to call. So it's always great. I'm just kidding. But no, just the other thing I wanted to ask is just to get back on the more personal side of things was the Mets. How did you wind up with the Mets?
Well, I grew up a Mets fan, which is a bad experience, but you can't always pick the winners. But yeah, I had it's a long story how I worked for the Mets, but I did work for the Mets for 1 year, and I don't even remember what year it was. Was it 2019? I think. I'm not sure. I forget. It was before COVID. 18 maybe. 18.
No, I get it. I come from I grew up in St. Louis, so everything's baseball crazy here. So I totally understand the everything's like, I know people from college that wound up working for Rawlings doing statistical stuff and all that. So I get where that's coming from in that regard, and just bat speed and all that.
So Andrew, you mentioned you might hang around. That would be terrific if you do. We're going to move on to sort of a roundtable conversation. I've queued up a couple of topics that we could speak about, and related links to inspire us. But really, if any of the topics that I bring up, if you have a related thought, I would encourage you to contribute to the conversation. To do that, you can request the mic. It's in the bottom left-hand side of the Spaces screen, and we'll bring you up to chat. One of the topics that we will be getting into is thinking about how possibly to track the progress of any coming Ukrainian offensive. And I suspect that's a topic you may have several great points to contribute on. So if you do stick around, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I will just encourage the audience, if you have enjoyed this conversation, please do retweet the space. We'd like to get as many voices in here as possible. Just a reminder that we are streaming this on YouTube. I believe there's still a link up in the nest. I'll try and move it forward in a moment in case you'd like to check it out there. Just before jumping into the sort of roundtable conversational topics, I'll also note there's a link to the space that preceded us that we're friendly with. Tochny, they are entirely Ukraine focused. Our effort here is a little bit broader in terms of looking at OSINT, even though a lot of our content touches on Ukraine as well. But if you're interested in further Ukraine news, do check out Tochny. The link to the recording of the space they held this afternoon, it will be in the nest. And just before moving on to some of the roundtable topics, I just, in order to focus on the nature of open source analysis, I occasionally like to give both good examples of OSINT and cautionary examples. And so I just have 3 or 4 cautionary examples I'll draw to your attention. They're all up in the nest, in case you'd like to follow along. So the first example is one where I saw a thread that was claiming that Putin wanted to exchange parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson in order for Crimea. And it was claimed to have been included in a report from British intelligence. And you'll see that I've inserted my tweet, which is mid-thread, where I had asked, hey, could you show me this source? I can't find it, after I had done my search. And then somebody helpfully responded to me, oh no, that was a fake report. And so, I responded, I'm glad I double checked, because this is the thing that I focus on, right? Is double checking sources, so that I'm not repeating false information. So if you look at the second item in the nest, that is this fake British intelligence report that was being cited by one of the breaking news channels. And because of the, so many people have become familiar with that sort of purple background and the text layout, I've seen several fake versions formatted in that way. And just because of the formatting, people are willing to accept them as true. So I wanted to bring that up as an example. If you see one of these floating around, sometimes people just take screenshots. Go and check I believe it's GCHQ here on Twitter to see if it's been posted by them, because otherwise it may well be a fake. Another example of making sure that you have context around what's the information that you're seeing. It's the third item in the nest. And so if you click through, it's a graphic that was put together by Vladimir Dichenko, who is terrific. And this is not a criticism of his work, but what it is he set out the rate of losses for different conflicts or different wars that Russia has been involved in. So I'm putting that graphic up, so it should now be the first thing in the nest, so you don't have to go clicking through. And the only reason I'm bringing this one up is because in this graphic, he is comparing the rate of casualties for the last month in Ukraine against the rates of casualties for other conflicts. But those are, I have to assume, average rates of loss across the length of a conflict. And so it's not a comparison of the most intense period against the most intense period. And so I just bring it up to point out that when you see precise numbers cited like this, you need to think about exactly what do they represent. For example, I even saw people in the replies to his graphic asking, is this casualties, as in killed and wounded, or is it just those killed? And it actually says right on the graphic, it is for personnel killed. So, it's a question of paying close attention to context. 2 more. There is a post up in the nest. It's the 4th back, I think. It's a post by Rob Lee. I'm bringing this one forward because he is replying to a tweet that was put up by and David has lots of interesting insight given his background military experience. But he's come out with statements about the number of units, both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side. And Rob Lee, who is highly respected and who I'm going to take in this particular case, has responded that they most definitely do not have the numbers that David has set out. And he says that none of these figures are even in the ballpark. And so, even a source who has some interesting insight at the tactical level may not be digging right down to understanding the numbers correctly. And so you really do have to be careful where you get your numbers from. And as per my last example, which is, it's up in the nest. It's a tweet by the Kiev Independent. And even a source as reliable as they are, They ran a story just 2 days ago where they had said that 10,000 Russian soldiers had surrendered via the call-in line. I believe it's called "I Want to Live." And then this tweet in the nest is actually their correction, where they came out and said, we reported 10,000 had surrendered when in fact 10,000 had contacted the hotline to learn about how it's possible to surrender, which is obviously a very different thing. And so I'm bringing all of these forward just as, think very critically, double check sources, do all the things that are necessary to good open source analysis, because even sources that appear to be right, like British intelligence or the Kiev Independent, occasionally are faked or may get it wrong. So with that, I was hoping to move into a roundtable discussion on some items. The first item I wanted to talk about is there have been several updates in terms of military equipment going to Ukraine, and some of them are fairly mysterious. And so I just wanted to touch on a number of the new deliveries. So I'll put that up in the nest. So that's the overview thread there. And these new deliveries include Ukraine using extremely, large crowdfunding efforts. And in this case, they've obtained 100 armored vehicles. There was also a conversation about Rheinmetall possibly building a factory in Ukraine. And I believe the executives from Rheinmetall came out and talked about how it would actually produce Puma, which is the new tank model that they're developing, as opposed to the Leopard. I'm sorry, the Panther?
Yeah, the Panther. Oh. Panther's the new. They're renaming the new tank the Panther. The Puma was that. Yeah,
that's right.
NATO thing.
I appreciate the correction. So what do you think about that, Random? Do you think that tank factory is likely to be built? I know the Russians were frustrated, and Medvedev actually came out and said, if they build a factory, we'll rain down on it with I think he said Kinzhal missiles. What do you think about that?
Good luck with the Kinzhal missiles. But the main thing is, I think it's more a long-term thing for weapons production, is that it's not just the Germans. Like, it's like, I know some members of the British were talking about producing some of their own components and stuff like that within Ukraine themselves. I think Rheinmetall building a factory in Ukraine makes a lot of sense in regards to production of more tanks, especially long-term. But I don't know if that will be like drawn out. I know everybody else's hand just shot up about it, so we can go to them. But I mean, it makes sense if they want to, for long term, to get Ukraine in the domestic tank production and European side for like European military sense. Like, it makes sense to start now than later. But Exit, you have co-host prerogative, so you can go next. And then I know we haven't heard from Scent Defender yet. I saw Chris's hand shoot up, but I know ID.10.tango wants to go as well.
Well, that's because we have an air raid. I was curious if the OSINT crowd could, over the next few minutes, when you get a moment, tell me what you see. That's all. Thanks.
Air raid prerogative.
Sure. Well, if anybody wants to shoot NatSec Media any updates, or if you know what regions may be at risk, we can discuss that briefly.
Eastern half.
Eastern half. Okay. Exit, would you like to go ahead?
I just wanted to note really quickly that in that Rheinmetall conversation, it specifically noted that they thought that getting their own air defense to protect that factory would be a really easy thing to do. And I thought that was really interesting, because we also saw this week the Russian MOD come out and tell businesses in Russia that if they wanted air defense, they should go purchase their own and bring them in as well.
I saw that. That led to a lot of questions I haven't seen good answers to.
Michael, you said the Russian foreign minister came out and said the Kinzhal missiles, right? Or did you say the defense minister?
I said Medvedev, who I think is their security council head at the moment.
So
Yeah.
I just remember, I think he's the deputy. He was the deputy head, but it's just another reminder of how much the fall from grace that Medvedev has undergone from being the president with the iPhone with Steve Jobs, and also just as a reminder, Lavrov got laughed at on stage in India this week. I don't want anybody to forget that because it was funny, even though the situation's terrible.
Yeah, Medvedev will probably rotate back into the presidency at some point because it seems to be musical chairs. But OSINT Defender, we haven't heard from you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Got a bit of a sore throat today, so sorry if I don't sound my best. So regarding the Rheinmetall thing, I honestly think it's kind of a joke. Rheinmetall just isn't going to build a factory in Ukraine, especially for a highly advanced tank that they just unveiled last year anytime soon. And it just doesn't make any sense for Rheinmetall's development lines either. All of their factories, other than a laser processing plant, is in Germany. They have one factory, and that's the laser plant in Switzerland. Everything else is in Germany, so it wouldn't make any sense for them to build a factory in Ukraine, especially for, again, a tank that was just unveiled last year and isn't going to start production probably until 2025 at the earliest. I think it's just kind of Rheinmetall trying to gain more public view, like they've been trying to the last couple of months, by saying that they're going to buy back all these tanks and do all this and do all that, and then they never do, or it just kind of fizzles out. Rheinmetall is a company that really likes to look good in the public eye, and has constantly in the past criticized the German government for doing this or doing that, even though they're a German arms company. So I don't see it happening at all. And even if they did, while the war was still going on, the Russians are right. They'd probably level the plant. There'd be no reason for them not to. If a NATO country is building a weapons factory in a country that they are technically at war with, it makes no sense to me. It's just too risky. It makes no sense, and it's for a project that isn't even close to starting full development. So I think it's just Rheinmetall talking to talk, honestly.
So, that's an interesting view. I certainly agree that the plant wouldn't be built for several years. I wonder whether that's just Rheinmetall, in your analysis, is that Rheinmetall trying to improve their public relations generally, or do you think that they're trying to do something specific, like to cover for criticism? And just before letting you come back on that, I will note, as per the second item in the nest, it was just announced in German media that Rheinmetall is now negotiating both with the Swiss to buy their stored Leopard tanks, and also negotiating to buy 96 former Italian Leopard 1s. So it looks like some of these long discussed tank buybacks may be advancing. But in any event, do you think they're just trying to improve their reputation in general, or do you think they have a specific goal?
I think it's in general. Most of the criticism that's happened within the German arms industry has been against the German military itself. So Rheinmetall really hasn't faced too much of that. But Rheinmetall is also a company that has struggled in the past, or recently specifically, with selling a lot of their equipment to foreign countries just due to certain issues with the German government. So this could be part of that. They're trying to really outsource the Panther that they are planning to develop to the European audience specifically. Because again, it seems like most European countries are pushing to buy the Abrams instead of any of the advanced Leopard 2s that they've been trying to make, and now the Panther. So it could just be that. It could be trying to convince the Ukrainian government, once the war's over, to switch over to the Panther. But again, who really knows? That the Panther, again, is an extremely experimental tank that was just announced last year, and it has a 130 millimeter gun on it. So unless Rheinmetall is going to develop ammunition for this, which they will eventually, it's not going to be easy either way. But it honestly, I just don't see it happening at all.
The Panther's a joint development between the Germans and the French, though, right? I mean, I think it's like a Leclerc's turret on top of Leopard chassis or something like that with the new gun. But Scent Defender, I wanted to follow up on that because we've already talked about it, mentioned the Swiss and just the whole thing, and this goes to the group, I guess, too. But just to follow up on that is that, do you think the Swiss are going to change their laws to allow for the sales or the weapons to be sent to Ukraine directly? Because I know that's been a big problem with when it comes to some of these arms deals. Like we've seen this with a couple of weapon systems like the Gepards ammunition and stuff like that. But yeah, it bounce back on what you're saying with it is just Rheinmetall has kind of over the course of this war been back and forth with their own government in Germany. Like we've seen it outplay with the leopard drama where it's like, oh, we can't send the tanks. Like, oh yeah, well, we get the tanks ready. And just that back and forth with them, I think is interesting in its own regard. But yeah, the idea that this tank and this tank factory is not going to be ready for a number of years is something to keep in mind. ID, so I'll let Defender answer, then we'll go to ID 10 Tango.
So regarding the Swiss, they're just now kind of coming around to the idea of sending ammunition to the German government to send to Ukraine. So I really doubt that they're going to allow tanks to be bought by Germany to send to Ukraine specifically for that purpose. It's possible, but I mean there'd have to be a lot of interesting talks behind the scenes with the Swiss government because it's just that's a big jump from ammunition to tanks. But again, it's possible.
I think, sorry, Mike, if I may, I think one thing we're failing to consider is that this might be utilized to backfill NATO countries who are giving Soviet tanks to Ukraine. I think that's more palatable for the Swiss to give, especially Leopard 2, not the Leopard 1. The Leopard 1 clearly has to be for the Ukrainians, but I think the Leopard 2s, I think a way you can bridge that is like, oh, hey, Eastern European countries, you gave us so many of your T-72s, you have more, we'll backfill you with these modernized Leopard 2s that have been in storage with the Swiss. And I think the Swiss will be more susceptible to that. And I think that's a better course of action rather than let's not push the Swiss neutrality. They take that very seriously. So let's see where we can get the most bang for our buck.
As always, All Source makes a great point. I understand that's also how it has been presented by Swiss politicians. It's been covered in the media that that's their intention. But then people are pointing out that if this is in an effort to allow Poland or Germany to send more of their Leopard 2s, what's the difference? Obviously, it's not to push to say that the Swiss Leopard 2s should go. But if Swiss Leopard 2s are going to backfill Polish or German Leopard 2s, it's essentially the same difference. It will also be interesting on the politics side. My understanding is that the Italian Leopard 1s, I believe, are just stored in Switzerland. I don't know if they're actually owned by the Swiss government. And so the nature of their control over export, I don't know if it varies. But as All Source points out, there being Leopard 1s, that might also be more acceptable than the 2s.
I mean, we also got to consider, sorry for jumping in, but I think let's say this war ends this year as in ceasefire. Let's just pretend. Let's make an argument to, okay, it goes into ceasefire. Ukraine will need to rearm, right? We cannot look at this just in a year time frame. We got to look at this 5 to 10 years down the road, right? And so if it ends in a ceasefire, right, where it's kind of quote unquote a frozen conflict, the expectation is Russia down the road might want to do this again. So we need to build up Ukrainian deterrence. Or let's say this war lasts for years, get everything in line now to ensure that the Ukrainians have the equipment necessary to be successful down the road. We can't be short-sighted on this.
Just before ID.10 or Michael goes, I just want to have an update for Chris because he asked. Kyiv, Zaporizhia, and Dnipro are all under air defense and air raid warnings.
Okay, so we will go ID10T and then Cameron. Go ahead.
Patiently listening. You guys are nibbling on the higher elevation here. All valid points, and logistics may be hard, but there are a multitude of defense industries looking to move into Ukraine, and for a number of points. One of the great restrictions that we have had were the export controls of weapon systems going to Ukraine. This country says no, while another country possesses it. All that is negated if it is manufactured in state. Those those controls are then eliminated. Now, higher elevation and longer term is that we are building a Western military in Ukraine. They are converting from prior Soviet to Western tactics under Western advisement, and with all the talks of NATO and whatnot, which of course is down the road, this is very lucrative for said industries to put systems into place and getting the ball going right now in order for manufacturing, because another factor of it is going to be the nation building. And we're going to be dumping money into Ukraine to get them back up to speed. An easy way to do that is the industrial complex to provide NATO with weapons, with manufacturing within Ukraine. There you go.
Well, and to that point, I know that Ukraine has signed industrial coordination agreements with Poland to coordinate on arms manufacturing, where Ukrainian companies are investing in Polish companies and vice versa. Ultimately, Polish companies may put their manufacturing plants in Ukraine, including Ukraine putting in sort of long-term purchase orders for the AHS Crab self-propelled guns.
And
you know,
I'm
go ahead.
but to add to that, this is becoming a worldwide handshake. Not only do you have Poland exploding in military power, wanting to advance, South Korea is in talks with putting a tank factory in Poland. So Poland manufactures in-house South Korean tanks. We have Taiwan going to collaborate, swap soldiers in Ukraine, Ukraine going over to Taiwan for advice over there. This is a Western handshake worldwide, and it's a big message to the adversaries.
I think we actually discussed this in other spaces, Michael, which is in regards to the South Korean production in Poland and the way that the ties between the South Korean military industrial complex and the Polish military industrial complex are like joining hand in hand. That was one of the reasons why Rheinmetall started getting way more vocal, is because they started getting spooked by the idea that in the long term, the German government not allowing weapons to be transferred over was hurting their own industrial base in that regard, because the Poles were going to provide an alternative through South Korea.
Well, and so to a degree, it may even be Rheinmetall being concerned about the encroachment of South Korean production or Polish domestic production and wanting to try to set up long-term plans, even if they're fairly vague at this point. I'll also note that, of course, Bayraktar has talked about setting up drone manufacturing in Ukraine as well. So there will be several manufacturers doing that same thing.
Well, Bayraktar and Ukraine have a long partnership with each other, because, I mean, if you talk about the Red Apple drone that they use, that has a Ukrainian jet engine in it. So obviously that partnership's going to keep just growing. But I don't know if Rheinmetall wants to set up a subsidiary called Rheinmetallski, but if Germany's not going to do it, I guess Poland might be a good place to set up a production house.
You never know. I see that Gurney has come up. Gurney, did you want to speak on this, or are you okay if we go around with hands?
Yeah, no, I wanted to speak to ID10T's point there, and I appreciate the nuance and insight he brings. That perhaps Rheinmetall does have an interest in this, and while agreeing with that, I'm going to also add just another bit of nuance to it. Rheinmetall is still subject, look, whether you want to call them a benefactor of their home state. I mean, their main clients that exist now, and while no one will really say this is, this occurs, they're really still a benefactor to the governments that they're existing within and working with. And so what I mean by that is so I appreciate ID10T saying, there could be a countervailing viewpoint that Rheinmetall actually does want to set this up. I would just take a cynical approach and say, even if that's the case, how effective can they be as a player? And this is to Random's point here. If K2 isn't operating within that political framework or dependencies, I would just ask, is Rheinmetall the right player and partner to capitalize on investment in Ukraine? And should we support that or not? Because as it currently exists, Rheinmetall currently has a bunch of different entanglements that allow them to do certain things and indirectly prohibit them from doing certain things. So I like to just add that. Thanks.
Yeah, and of course, that's a fair point. To the extent that building cooperation with German manufacturers might be a useful thing for the Ukrainians to do as well, they may be playing sort of an optional game. Do you know what I mean? As in, Rheinmetall may come with some strings, but at the same time, if a relationship can be built, then perhaps that greases, the ability of Ukraine to access German military industry more broadly. But it could cut both ways. I think I'm not sure of the order. We'll go with Cameron and then John. Go ahead, Cameron.
Okay, so yeah, I was going to speak on the Rheinmetall plant in Ukraine. So I heard a lot of people saying that it might just be like an updated turret of a Panther on top of a 2A4 Leopard hull. And I know they update the Leopard hulls into some of the newer tanks like the 2A6 and the 2A7, but I don't think it would be full up tank production, especially because they're listing a number of like 200 million euros. And if anybody knows anything about like large scale industrial production, they're saying 400 tanks a year. I really do not think you're going to crank 400 tanks a year out of a 200 million euro plant. So it might just be final assembly or certain components, which could affect the export controls and make it more reasonable. But I think Rheinmetall is serious about trying to build more production and trying to build export capacity because at the end of the day, they're not in the PR game, they're in the game to make money. So as many tanks as they can sell and as much maintenance as they can provide to those tanks and high margin parts and service, I think they will. But I think we have to remember that you're not going to build up a giant capacity way bigger than the U.S. plant at Lima for $200 million or 200 million euros. And I think there's a lot more complexities and it would be years. So I think they should focus about European production first, especially because those plants would be vulnerable. And on final assembly, you'd have to have a large place to put it together. So unlike their ammunition production, which can be kind of, oh, you make the filler here, you make this here, you make this here, like spread out through Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, it would be a lot harder to kind of hide the plant and defend it.
Well, those are great nuanced points. The only thing I'll add is, I'm sure you're correct on the amount of output that would flow from an investment of that size. I will note the interesting innovations that are happening in terms of chassis turret or chassis gun that are developing. People are getting pretty creative, and I noted Poland building the AHS Crab self-propelled guns, and my understanding is those are built on South Korean hulls. I think the K2 hulls, but I may be mistaken. And so there's a lot of creativity happening right now. Just before going to John, Exit, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Nope, I was wrong on what I was going to say, so sorry about
that. You're welcome that we gave you enough time to realize that. John, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, just a quick point on the K2 production in Poland. That doesn't have much to do with the Ukrainian conflict. That's because Poland is buying a number of. I mean, it's already been stated once a couple minutes ago. They're buying South Korean platforms, and so that's been that process has been going on for a couple of years now. I'd say like a little year and a half to 2 years now. The question that I wanted to pose that's kind of popped up in my head just now is Rheinmetall's ever growing signaling that they're looking for international partnerships. It's weird that they're doing that right after Germany has stated that this 100 billion multiple hundreds of billions of dollars investment into their industry. And could that be indicative that this statement by Germany is kind of hollow and that there hasn't actually been any type of investment put forth?
It looks like Cameron might have a response to that. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so Germany's 100 billion euro fund may seem like a lot on the surface, But I think the German arms manufacturers are realizing it is still wholly inadequate in terms of rebuilding their armed forces. And there really hasn't been much of it put into the land forces. So, like, the two major German companies that make the land vehicles, like KMW and Rheinmetall, I think are a little mad that they haven't seen increased orders from the German government. It's been more so, the F-35 purchase and a couple of munitions purchases. I think one of Germany, maybe it's Pistorius, like Germany's defense minister, was saying it would take more like 300 billion to actually have the intended effect the 100 billion was supposed to have. So I think they are trying to expand their market, and they are trying to get extra production, and they are trying to make it look like, oh, hey, we can do this, we can do that, partner with us to countries outside of Germany as well to get that business. But I think the 100 billion euro fund sounds nice, but you got to remember they underfunded their military for decades, and the land forces are not the major portion where the money's going. So I think it's kind of a bid to get outside money, or just as much money as possible, because they are a business. They do have investors. So I think that's the whole play here, even if they exaggerate their capabilities sometimes.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah. I was gonna say you make a good point that they have underfunded their military for a large portion, and they have made these promises before too, which is I think important to note as well. Like you touched on that as well. They have made these promises multiple times before, and either have done nothing, or they kind of do the motions, and then they don't really follow through. The question I'd ask you, Cameron, and anyone else as well is: do you think they're going to follow through this time, or do you think they've kind of been woken up by this war in Ukraine?
I think to a degree they have. I mean, you don't go out and add 100 billion euros if you're not trying to fix something. But I think the Germans might be more focused on the aspect of looking like they're doing something and adding some capability, rather than actually willing to commit the funds and resources to add enough capability. So I think it will help, and they are serious about it, but they're not nearly as serious about it as they should be, because war is on the European continent right now. And it's a major war. It should have woken them up more than this. So I'd say they're kind of half asleep, half awake, but before they were completely asleep. So it is serious, but it is nowhere near adequate.
I see we've been joined by Charles. Did you want to go ahead on this?
Yeah, I did. Thank you very much. Yeah, I live in Germany. I've been following this debate quite closely since it was announced in February, and it was a very hot debate. Twice in the last several months. One was in the budget discussion when the federal budget was passed. I think that made the rounds as well of the 2% threshold and whether the special fund counted towards that or not. That was debated hotly in the Bundestag. There was not much debate at that time in terms of anyone saying that it should ever be cut or that it wasn't enough. In fact, if anything, the main criticism to the defense minister at the time was on the pace at which it had been spent, whether it was enough and what it included. After Lambrecht stepped down, one of the main candidates to take her place was a woman named Högel. She came out actually on that weekend prior to when she was the main candidate at that time and proposed increasing it to the 300 billion because the four dimensions which is included, it was very clear that the 100 billion was not going to cover it. Also that inflation was eating away at the power of that. It was also funded by debt, seeing as what little had been allocated in the first year, and then also now in the second year. I believe the allocation from this year is only going to be 8.5 billion of that. Of course, this thing is shrinking. I believe one MP quoted it in the debate as like butter melting in the sun. So that is very hotly debated here in Germany in the center parties, the main parties, always with the intention to actually increase it rather than to try to decrease it. Immediately afterwards, then of course came the realization it didn't include munitions, which then became the next hot topic. So that's just sort of the status of debate here in Germany over the last several months.
I appreciate that background, and this is partly why I enjoy having these conversations on Twitter Spaces, is that we have people with from such varied backgrounds and with different expertise. So I learned so much when we have these talks as well. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just keeping in mind your point made earlier about Michael, about Ukraine's possibility, like how to look for Ukrainian offensives, and I was wondering if possibly it seems like everyone's running around trying to get as much arms and equipment as they can for Ukraine. And it seems like it's almost at reaching a fever pitch now. Do you think this could indicate a possible kind of like a timeline? Ukraine has set this timeline, or maybe Ukraine, in conjunction with military thinkers who are helping them out from across the world. Do you think it could indicate that they set this timeline for a possible offensive, and that there's kind of a date, and we need certain amounts of equipment before this time. I don't think the Abrams are going to get there before we see any type of major offensive, but I think with the other equipment, the Leopards, and I think people sometimes don't mention enough the Twardies and all the T-72s that the Czechoslovakia and Poland has been sending, because that's going to be the vast majority. That's been the vast majority of armor that's been sent there has been by those two countries. Do you think this could indicate a potential maneuver offensive soon?
I've asked in several spaces when we've had various experts in the timeline between when armor, particularly tanks, are delivered and how soon they can be implemented or deployed, just to think about, is there still a window? So would anything that is newly announced now still be of use in an offensive, even if it were an extended offensive, perhaps, toward the end? And unfortunately, the answer you often get is, it depends, a lot of which goes to how the Ukrainians are deploying particularly smaller numbers, like the Challengers, for example, or the mix as between Leopard 1, Leopard 2, and also the training. And it's just not clear whether that's going to be a bottleneck at all. And so I don't know whether any equipment announced now might be available, say, by the summer. I think it's possible. But I just don't know whether all of the other pieces are in place, for it to sort of have traction. But occasionally we are surprised on the upside. So just the other day, I believe it was the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom made comments saying that while the UK has announced 14 Challengers, he then came out and said that promises had been made to Zelensky that, in fact, double that number would be provided. I haven't heard a UK source confirm that yet, but then it was also discussed that, in fact, enough Ukrainian personnel were training on Challengers to man up to 28 tanks. So that's sort of the upside, the unexpected upside that we weren't expecting. If 28 Challengers are available, they'll have enough personnel to man them. So I found that pretty interesting. Since you posed the question, John, I'll just turn it back to you quickly. Do you think it implies a specific timeline?
So personally, I think it does, because it seems like it's reaching a fever pitch, and it seems like Ukraine, and specifically if you're going to talk about rhetoric coming from Ukraine, if you look at directly before the Kharkiv offensive, Ukrainians' rhetoric, whatever they're talking about, tends to reach a fever pitch directly before a major action. And before their rhetoric was, this diversionary rhetoric talking about Kherson, and then they hit Kharkiv. So I would say it does, but I've seen a lot of people who say, the possibility, because of the defense in depth, and I was saying it at first before until I went, and started to look at the maps and started to look more at the terrain, so like where is there a possibility of an offensive? If you look at the Kherson, if they were able to break through in one area of Kherson, it's extremely conducive to armored warfare down there. More specifically, maneuver warfare. It's flat kind of plains, very dry areas. That is really great for armor. I'm not saying that's where they would go, because obviously, why talk about it so much if you're going to do that? Like, Why tell the enemy you're going to go down there? But it just seems there's a couple of areas where I think they could a breakout would benefit them a lot, especially with the aid that's been coming in. But because the aid's been so staggered, um, it just seems that's where it gets confusing, and that's where the wrench is kind of thrown in the idea.
Well, hopefully, if it is implying a timeline, hopefully everything gets there by the deadline, so that they can have as much of a push as possible when the time to go happens. Random, I think you might have had your hand up. Did you want to come in with something?
I did for a second, but I don't really have anything else to add over the tank discussion. But I will say that the K9 Thunder chassis is the basis for the crab that you were looking for. So it is a Korean platform. That being said, I know the topic of fighter jets has been discussed a couple of times. Has anybody else seen that NBC News report about the 2 Ukrainian pilots in the United States looking at F-16s?
I did see that, and one thing that interested me about that, I understand that's just for evaluation purposes. I don't know what specifically, if they pass the evaluation, what it means. I don't know if that's been explained. What it did remind me of was reports from back in the late summer that they had several Ukrainian pilots training on simulators at private facilities in the United States. And they had media attend, and apparently U.S. military personnel were occasionally dropping by just to keep tabs on their progress there in the simulator training. And I'm wondering if the 2 pilots referred to in the NBC article may have already had a bunch of simulator training through that program. I haven't seen a connection to it, but it wouldn't surprise me.
I believe it was Warzone or The Drive. With that back then, what was it, like 8 months ago? They were talking about how the Ukrainians had already built their own E-10 simulator or something like that. I think that was Rojaway's article.
It probably was The Drive. I think they were F-16 simulators specifically, which is why it came to my mind as being relevant now. But before we keep going, Exit, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just quick reminder to everybody that if you're enjoying what you're listening to, you can find more resources up in the nest, and you can also find them down below on the furthest right-hand corner, bottom corner, sorry, of your screen, where the comments is, and down there you can also retweet the conversation and get people in there if you like. And Kitty has been kind enough to send along that NBC article, so I will make sure that's in the nest as well. If you are requesting and your DMs are not open, I need you to DM me and let me know what you wanted to talk about, please and thank you.
Thanks very much for that reminder. Just to finish up the resources that I had on new equipment. So I had in mind the announcement of the Extra 14 Challengers. I had in mind these 2 Ukrainian pilots being evaluated for the F-16. Up in the nest, there is also a photo. It's believed to be the first evidence of the use by the Ukrainians of their domestically produced Vilka multiple launch rocket systems, which is interesting because there have been some strikes that have happened where it's been unclear what systems have been used, and there's been speculation it might be the Turkish, the TRLG or TLRG, fairly long range. But now that we see that the Vilka is in use, that is also a possibility for some of these instances. Also, I just wanted to highlight some kind of mysterious arms supply questions. So I'm going to slowly build these out into the nest. The first is by Ukraine Weapons Tracker, and it's most recently observed the use of Iranian, I think it was 82 millimeter mortars. Or excuse me, these are 120 millimeter mortars, but they're noting that this is the 3rd or 4th type of munition from Iran that they've seen evidence of. And that's led them to speculate in that tweet that there's such a wide variety and volume of Iranian munitions that it's likely that there's a 3rd-party purchaser buying them, to the extent that Iran would not be directly selling them to Ukraine. So that's a very interesting development, kind of an unknown mystery. It almost mirrors the mystery around some Pakistani munitions that were provided, and it was understood that those had been purchased by a third party as well. So I wonder whether it's one third party who's acting in Pakistan and Iran and all around the world, or whether it is several countries that are sort of pursuing the strategy at the same time. Cameron, did you want to speak to any of that?
Yeah, so I've kind of been tracking the whole munition situation, and they have found a lot of ammunition from Pakistan. I know there was like 150 something crates that were allegedly sent containing ammunition from Pakistan. They found Iranian ammunition on both sides of the conflict. So what looks like is happening is Iran supplies a lot of proxies in the Middle East, and even other countries in the Middle East as well via contracts. And I know the British and the Americans have been mentioned directly in some of the reports, but there's been a lot of speculation that kind of like the reverse of what's that movie, the Nicolas Cage one, like the Lord of War or whatever,
Yep.
where American businessmen, instead of selling it to armed groups, they're going around and buying them from armed groups and from third-party countries, and they're not really talking about the end destination, and sometimes it appears they might even be fudging it, and they're ending up in Ukraine. Some of them were just direct transfers, but basically we have money, some people need money, they have ammunition, and it gets sent there via a third party some way. So I'm sure there's CIA front companies or other things at work, or maybe even private contractors. But I have noticed a lot of that ammunition supply is ending up, and it appears relatively large scale.
Well, there's also that stuff they seized off of Yemen too, right? That's that was reportedly being discussed or sent over to Ukraine as well.
Yeah, that's small arms. So it's not exactly the larger ammunition like the 152 and the 122 they've seen, but there is a lot of small arms stuff that we've seized and have in inventory from the past that also seems to be going over there, because it is kind of Soviet caliber ammunition like Ukraine uses on a lot of their weapons, so it makes a lot of sense to send, as well as there's also guns with it. I assume there's probably some of that going on as well.
Go ahead, Gurney.
Well, yeah, along this topic, I think Intel Walrus a day or so ago, he likes to sleuth some Air Mobility Command pallets and stuff, and it looks like one of his, it's alleging that the Air Mobility Command delivered maybe several pallets of Russian manufactured small arms ammunition, 7.62, to, I'm getting this wrong here, help me out here, Somalia, or actually, I don't think it was Somalia. It might have been Eritrea. I could be off by this, but if you check his post out, just interesting the number of players that are able and willing to get their hands in these third-party markets somehow to get that ammunition, and then obviously in this case there's pictures of the ammunition being delivered. Again, I don't know the substance of it. That's what's being alleged here, but just to the point there to back the conversation up.
Yeah, go ahead, Random.
Yeah, just to get on that, recently, and this was a change, I put this in the nest, Air Mobility Command has, for operational security reasons and for other reasons, taken all the markings off their tails. So the aircraft, the gray tails as they're called, the transport aircraft and tankers and stuff like that, they used to have those identifying markings like the letters and everything like that. They're all gone. So the Air Force has taken those off, marking what unit they are. And I find that interesting in regards to this conversation, as well as that being happening this week. So I just figure I put that up in the nest. And also, guys, if you are liking what you're hearing and want to share more or get more out there, please retweet the space. It's always helpful.
Thanks very much. There was one last mystery that I'll put to the space. I'm not expecting a ton of discussion about it necessarily, but it might be a mystery that somebody wants to go off and investigate further. I don't know the answer to this, so spoiler up front, I can't tell you what's true. But there was some controversy over the allegation that Serbia had provided some Grad rockets to Ukraine. And so there are 3 tweets up there in the nest, including, again, I think it was Ukraine Weapons Tracker that first broke the news that it was believed Serbia had provided these. And then the order it went in was Russia was upset about this, and so they called in the Serbian ambassador to answer to this question. I'm not sure what happened at the diplomatic level, but then the tweet in the nest from JR2, who's a very good source, he came out and said, well, here are documents that are circulating around that are claiming that these were from a Serbian company, then they were bought by a Canadian company, and then they were, I don't know whether transferred directly or through a circuitous route, but that there was a Canadian company involved in it, and here's some paperwork for that. But then the last step in the chain that I saw was a comment from Rybar, who, again, he was brought up in the mapping context to Andrew, and just like Andrew, I don't put much faith in what he says, but he claimed that those documents, the same that were circulated by JR2, were in fact fakes, and that some of the orders made reference to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, or excuse me, not the Ukrainian, the Serbian Minister of Defense, and was spelling his name wrong, and that there were other errors in the forms. And so I'll admit I have no idea what's true. I don't know whether the photos of the grads originally put up by Ukraine weapons trackers, if he was fooled by a fake story and those were in use not in Ukraine but elsewhere. I don't know if the paperwork is real or not, so this remains an open mystery. If somebody wanted to dig into it, it's the sort of thing where you could come back in a future space and give us an update on what you found. Could be interesting. Cameron, go ahead.
I know there's been some things where countries allegedly supply something and Russia has backlash, and then they say that it's actually not for Ukraine and that the end user is the country that purchased it, but then it somehow still ends up in Ukraine. There were some of those allegations, like when South Korea transferred 100,000 shells to us from Poonsang Industries of 1.5 millimeter. But I think those were actually for U.S. end use, is what ended up coming out, and that they're just the backfill stockpiles we sent from our strategic stockpiles. But there has been some talk like that. I remember, I think it was 3,000 Serbian rockets it was like extended range ones with a 40-kilometer range, still unguided, that were allegedly sent. So I don't know the truth on that, but it does appear like there's both Russian and U.S. and British arms dealers at play. I know there's been talks where, I don't know the truth to this, but in Bulgaria and in Africa, when they're trying to buy up these supplies of old Soviet ammunition, sometimes the Russians are outbidding the Americans and sometimes the Americans are outbidding them. So it appears like they're fighting for this foreign supply, and it's kind of a weird shadow market where no one really is admitting what's going on, but it makes it really hard to tell what's true and what's not true.
Absolutely. So it's maybe it will be a challenging thing to pursue, but I would invite anybody who can untangle it. I bet you'll get a lot of attention if you can show definitively what's happened, because I know there are lots of people paying attention to the issue. Okay, so just for pacing to set everybody's expectations, I was planning on running for maybe another 30 or 40 minutes. I had set 4 questions. I usually try to set out more than we're going to have time to get through, just to make sure we don't run short. So I'm thinking maybe we can spend 15 or 20 minutes on each of the next 2. And the last topic of South Africa isn't quite as timely, so maybe I'll save that for a future space. I was hoping to move on to a quick discussion about the developments in the votes on NATO accession for Sweden and Finland, because there have been several developments, and some things may come up on that front in the next week. I guess before I get too deep into it, I'll go to ID10T.
I rose my hand kind of late. I don't want to backtrack you. It's about the previous topic.
Well, go for it, and I'll dive into it once you're done. Go ahead.
So, no, I have not seen any open source intelligence on this, but I would not be surprised if there are some nation states out there that have seen the fault of Russia and have recently found out that U.S. military supplies is suddenly on sale on a condition of some small arms transfers. That's all.
Okay, well, that's an item people can keep an eye out for. So moving back, the way I was framing this subject was it's about the NATO accession, but essentially it's about Hungary and Turkey. And so by way of background, there were a few tweets up in the nest for people to come up to speed. One of those, I think it's the fifth back, if you want to have a look at it, by the Finnish embassy in the United States. Last week, Finland approved the last steps in their law so that once the accession votes by the other members of NATO to accept them, once those NATO members have approved them, apparently no further steps have to be taken within Finland. And there was some debate over whether Finland would proceed in this way or whether they would hold out and insist that Sweden must come at the same rate, because there's been speculation that Hungary and or Turkey may approve Finland faster for their own political reasons. But in any event, Finland has now approved it, so they could proceed on their own if that's the way it goes with Hungary and Turkey. Apparently, that all this last week, the Hungarian parliament was debating approval. My understanding is that they've continued to push that debate down the road. They did not approve it. However, Hungarian President Viktor Orban's Fidesz party has come out publicly and said that they would back approval of both Sweden and Finland. So there's an article up there about that, I think maybe from Foreign Policy. But at the same time, there's now been some speculation that Hungary may be looking at this as an opportunity where they hadn't been making any objections prior to this. And the suggestion is that they may try to connect some changes that they want in terms of funding within the European Union to granting their approval on the NATO vote. You know, the two groups don't completely overlap, but the suggestion is that that has been their interest. I'm just adding another thread to the nest that I came across just before the space started. It's by Mina Alander, who is a great commentator from that region. And she has been noting that while Hungary had been happy to stay quiet and bide their time, and that Turkey had been publicly out using this issue as leverage, what that meant was that the issue remained outstanding and Hungary could simply wait. And this is her inference, her analysis. But the suggestion that now that it looks possible that Turkey may approve, the accession, that Hungary is thinking now is the time that if they're going to try to trade on this matter, they have to begin to do that now. And so she's suggesting that this is a critical time. I'd have a read of her analysis to see what you think about it. But it is pretty interesting. And we'll see what happens in the next week.
Both Turkey and Hungary, I'll just add this, sorry, but both Turkey and Hungary are meeting with representatives from Sweden and Finland to discuss NATO accession on the 9th of this month. So we'll see, like you said, we'll see over the coming week, because it seems like they're both doing that. But yeah, like Hungary was more geared up to put the vote on for Finland and Sweden. They're geared up at the end of last month, and then Orban pushed it back, and then he pushed it back again, and then he delayed it again, and now they're having meetings on the same day the Turks were supposed to have meetings with them. So that's an interesting factoid.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's another critically important thing happening on the 9th, which is that's when I'll be holding my next space. Thursday night, 9 p.m. Eastern. I'll put the link in the nest in just a moment so you can set your reminder. We may have news, perhaps, announcements will come out of those meetings of Hungary with Finland and Sweden. We'll find out. I then wanted to mention the Turkish consideration. And so we'll see if anybody is interested in talking about this. It's a complicated one that we might not cover in the 5 minutes I've maybe allocated to it. And we may have to revisit it. But the latest updates on that issue are that it was announced that the Turkish elections would continue and be held on May the 14th, apparently with no delay, because there was a debate about whether they would be delayed after the earthquake, and that's not the case. At the same time, this past week, there is the opposition parties have been working in a coalition, and I can't remember the exact phrase they use for their group, but it's something like the six-member table or something like that. So it's 6 of the opposition groups. And they had put out sort of a rough platform collectively. And then just this last week, they came out and announced who their joint candidate for president would be. And the candidate is the leader of the largest of the opposition parties in coalition. However, this caused a little bit of controversy. And only a few days later, the leader of the second largest party, so the largest opposition party, as I understand it, and people can correct me, is a center-left party. And the second biggest opposition party is a right-wing party. And that the leader of the right-wing party came out and said that she did not support the leader of the largest party as the candidate for the coalition. And this is partly because there are other politicians in Turkey, namely the mayors of the 2 largest cities in the country, who are regarded as being more popular on a personal level. And so this leader of the second biggest party was breaking with the coalition to a degree and saying, she personally did not back this candidate and thought one of the mayors would be a better candidate. Apparently that was then walked back just a little bit because her party said, well, we're not breaking up the coalition, but we still don't approve of the proposed coalition candidate for president, which leaves a little bit of uncertainty. Now, it may have advanced a little bit since then, but it makes the coalition a little bit shaky, which is important because some polls say that Erdogan's, I believe it's the AKP party, is polling around 40%, but that the coalition parties are polling, several points higher than that when they're united, or they're prospectively united. But if they begin to split, it may mean that they lose their collective lead. And so how this shakes out may determine who gets power in Turkey, which, is at a critical moment where Turkey is supporting the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and it's sort of a balance of power player in the region. So there's really a lot at play between now and May the 14th. So this is a story that we're going to try and stay up to date on in this space. I know that Exit's been following it closely, partly because of the grain initiative. Did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so just to put a little bit more context around that, Aksener is her name, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, so definitely do not repeat my pronunciation. But she's been lambasted in the media and Twitter and a lot of other places, basically saying that this was political suicide, and that a lot of her votes will leave her. I presume that's probably why she walked back some of the statements after the fact, essentially saying that they are still going to be part of the 6, but this isn't the way they think that this should go, etc. I have been talking to a number of reporters and others in Turkey about what they thought it would mean if Erdogan didn't win the election. And to be clear, most of them are really undecided, especially after this week, as to who exactly will win. But a fair number of them specifically said that they thought that the 6 might actually be even better. I've seen a number of articles and other sources from people that have essentially laid out that their foreign policy although it was very short and only about 5 pages long in their actual policy document, it very much outlined the fact that they were very supportive of the West. They would be far more supportive of NATO and maybe even more heavy-handed, for lack of a better term, um, but still independently continue cooperation and communication with Russia, meaning that essentially there is a giant portion of Turkey's economy that really does depend on the cooperation with Russia, and they have a massive inflation problem at the moment. Um, but in order to kind of keep status quo on the economic side, they will have to play ball, but it's likely that when it comes to NATO matters, they might be a little bit stronger hand than Erdogan is.
Sure, sure. I appreciate that detail. Just before going to random, I just want to answer the question, since we're often trying to talk about things that are open source. I said something similar in the last space, or perhaps two back, but we wouldn't normally get into election politics. And I don't think we're, at least many of the panelists aren't speaking about the Turkish election out of an interest in the outcome for partisan political reasons, but that it is worth trying to understand what is likely to happen in an election in a country that is as significant as Turkey, to an issue that we're particularly interested in, being the effects on the war in Ukraine, given the role that Turkey plays. So, while the information we're getting is often from media or political analysts on the ground, it's not maybe in the nature of open source, but it's still very relevant, because the outcome of these events will set the conditions in which all of these other things that we're analyzing through more traditional open source means come to their expression. So I just want to make clear that it's related, and I think it is very important, even if you're mainly focused on either military matters or hardware like military equipment. This will matter in the long run. Random, go ahead.
I think it's just important to point out that the effect of these earthquakes in some regards, because we've kind of lost it in a bit of the news, but it needs to be mentioned that over 50,000 people have died from this, and there's over 1.5 million people left homeless as a result of these earthquakes. In addition to that, I do have to remind, it's the plural of earthquakes. There was the initial 6.7 or close to 7 Richter scale earthquake. Then that was followed up by a 6.2 aftershock and a 5.2 earlier in this week alone, after those earthquakes from the beginning of last month. So there's a lot going on, and it's not, the domestic politics would play a role in it, but it's also just the building codes and the construction codes within Turkey itself. There's a lot of destroyed buildings with way things have been done structurally within Turkey that's coming to its head that probably won't get as much play as what's going on. But because of the fact that Turkey has set itself up as the deciding vote on the NATO membership, and with what's going on internally, and with the not just the political situation, but the fact that there have been these earthquakes, there's a lot to focus on when it comes to Turkey, especially not just the grain deal and everything else that we've been talking about so far.
Exit, do you want to take co-host prerogative?
Just real quick, to your point, Random, it's really important to say that, like, their foreign minister has been really busy with a lot of other things. The first statement that we've seen on him renegotiating the Black Sea Grain Initiative was today, which we're 14 days out. That's short. That's way shorter than we saw on the last renewal. And also, arguably, most of their Navy is currently ported and supporting these earthquake victims and homeless people and people who need medical assistance. Their brand new aircraft carrier hadn't even gone through any of the testing that it needed to, and they had moved it in already, and it's operating as a hospital currently. Um, like they are very distracted and very busy dealing with an earthquake, and how that affects what we see happening with their support for Ukraine, or even the conversations about NATO. It's absolutely playing a role.
Thanks for that. John, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. The first thing is I put a link by Atlantic Council up in the nest. It's a kind of like it's like a tracker basically. I'm trying to figure out the best word for it because it's like a bunch of different things. A tracker being one of them. But it's a tracker that they have specifically for the ascension of Sweden and Finland to NATO. So basically, all the big updates are. I'm pretty sure almost all the updates are up in there. Second thing I would say is, do you guys remember the coup attempt a couple of years ago in Turkey? And
yeah.
Yeah. And remember hearing about how even U.S. officials were saying that it seemed like Erdogan was using that as a means to basically like you could call it a casus belli, a justification essentially to crack down on his political opposition. Do you think we might see as elections come about, and we might see kind of the fruit of his efforts kind of come into the forefront?
That's an interesting question. One thing I didn't mention earlier, but is related to your question, is that to the extent that some of the most popular politicians in Turkey on a personal basis, one of them is the mayor of Istanbul. And it was only, I believe, in the last 2 months that the mayor of Istanbul was charged with a crime and convicted. And it was something, don't quote me, but it was something like discrediting one of the government ministers. And I believe that the way that he was alleged to have criminally discredited this man was by calling him an idiot, which, we in the West would, say it's impolite, but it's, kind of par for the course and certainly not criminal. The reason that it matters is because apparently with this conviction, the mayor of Istanbul is not eligible to stand for election to certain levels of office, including the presidency. And so the belief is that, this is a charge that was trumped up just to keep him from running. And while that's not exactly of the nature of crackdown that you're referring to, John, I think it's related in that, it's kind of the dirty tricks approach. Whether there will be, additional crackdowns or additional dirty tricks, I can't say for sure. I would suspect that if polling is looking bad for Erdogan as we approach the election, that the risk goes up quite a lot that at least the dirty tricks come into play. I've been trying to look for good polling about what's going on in Turkey now, but when I search, I don't know enough to distinguish which pollsters are reliable. And it seems to be that there are pollsters who are saying Erdogan is way ahead, and there are others who are saying that the opposition coalition is way ahead. And it may just be that the polling outlets, many of them are partisan and essentially cheerleading as opposed to actually polling. So what we may have to do is, I do intend to follow these stories in these spaces going forward. And we do have some friends of the space who are based in Turkey, including some Turkish political analysts. So we'll see if we can't get some of them in to speak to some of these questions. And so that's sort of two items that we're going to keep on the agenda going forward, being the accession issue, particularly how the Turkish election plays into it, and then related to Turkey as well is the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which hopefully either Thursday or Sunday we'll try and set up a space to focus on. So there is an invitation to Thursday's space in the nest, and if you want to follow along with us as we keep on top of these the developments in these issues, set yourself a reminder.
Just as an irony, Michael, in addition to just Erdogan in arrest or convicting the mayor of Istanbul as a crime. It harkens back also to the fact that Erdogan himself was the mayor of Istanbul, who was convicted of a crime which caused him to leave his office back in the late 90s. So it's kind of a weird full circle thing going on.
Yeah, truth can be stranger than fiction sometimes. John, I thought I saw your hand going up and then down. Did you want to say a last word on this point?
Oh yeah. No, I'm gonna hop out the space, so I just want to thank you for having the space, for having me up here.
Yeah, thank you very much. We always appreciate your insight. Wolverine, before we move to the next topic, did you want to go ahead?
I was just kind of curious. Is there going to be any topics like concerning either Bakhmut, Volodar, or armor, artillery, or things that go bang in the middle of the night?
So we are 3 hours into this space, and we spent the first 2.5 hours talking about those things. And we had a great conversation, that engaged All Source and OSINT Defender, and Andrew Perpetua was in chatting to us. So you can always listen back to the recording, or I know that Aaron is holding his space tonight, and so we'll put an invite to that up in the nest in the next few minutes, and then hopefully Aaron can touch on some of these same issues, and Wolverine, you can scratch the itch to talk about weapons.
We talked about so much boom boom, man. It was great.
I hate you, Random. I really do right now.
This is why it's important to remember Sundays at 4, Thursdays at 9.
Wait a minute. It is Sunday 4. It's 4 o'clock my time right now.
Well, touche. Sundays at 4 on the East Coast. So Sundays at 1 for you.
1 o'clock. Oh man,
yeah. I know.
Crap.
But next time.
Okay, fine.
It's almost like we scripted this exchange, but I'm glad we got it in. Okay. So I often try to run the space for about 3 hours. I am hoping to take another 10 or 15 minutes to see if we can get a little bit of brainstorming in. This may be another item where we will have to come back to it from time to time. And this is the idea of preparing people to think about how will we track the progress of a Ukrainian offensive that may begin in the next month or two. And it has a couple of elements to it. There's literally how do we see how progress is advancing across the map. There's the idea of looking at what points might be critical. Sorry, I'm just adding things to the nest, so I'm briefly distracting myself there.
While you do that, I do want to do a happy death of Stalin Day, Michael, because on March 5th, 1993, Joseph Stalin died.
Thank you very much for reminding me about that. There were some interesting videos going around this morning of people going up to protest Stalin's death at the celebrations and then being arrested. So that's something that happens. So in any event, tracking how progress of an offensive may be moving across the map, what sites are critical from a strategic perspective, and evaluating, what would be judged success. And so these aren't answers, but I've put up a few things that might be helpful. So for instance, I've put up a link to the map that Brady Afric has been developing, maintaining, that sets out all of the entrenchments across the front line, particularly in that Zaporizhia region that is so often speculated may be the focus of an offensive down toward Melitopol. And just to start the brainstorming, what I will likely be doing is I'll be looking at this map and I'll be looking at, if the Ukrainians are likely to want to seize Tokmak and then eventually Melitopol, what are some of the major cities at crossroads? And, to develop a list of those, even ranked in order from north to south as an offensive may proceed. And then how would you monitor for developments on that front? So by building up a list of trusted sources, good OSINT sources here on Twitter or in other places, people like Andrew Perpetua, who we spoke with today. But then also, if you have these keywords, you can be searching for them manually. Interestingly, it may not be ready in time for us to make use of it, but I thought I would point it out to you in the first tweet in the Nest Now. One of the entries in there on how to monitor for a coming Ukrainian offensive, I was doing some searching for my own sake to see whether it's possible, whether there were any apps that could automate keyword searching on Twitter, or ultimately on Telegram as well. And I came across an article from a few months ago where it was noted that in recent updates, it looks like in Twitter's software, they have begun to build in some infrastructure for a tool that's not yet public, as far as I know, that would allow you to set alerts on keyword searches, which is very interesting. But until that's working, we can't make use of it. So what I would say is, if anybody here knows about any kind of a third-party app, particularly one that survived the recent changes to the Twitter API that allows keyword searches, if either you come up to let us know or you put it in the replies to this space, that would be terrific, as building out tools like that are super helpful. But what I'll be doing is looking at that map for critical crossroads. I'll be cross-referencing it with the work that Brady has done on the areas that are fortified, because obviously the capture of fortified positions or breakthrough beyond fortified positions would be a significant development in the success of an offensive. At the same time, I think it's interesting to evaluate what would be success for an offensive. I don't have an answer for that, but what I have put in the Nest, I think it's now the second item up there. Way back in September, some people were asking, so I think it was the defense editor of The Economist asked, what would constitute success in the Kherson offensive? And I had responded and said that I thought that the capture of Nova Kakhovka would indicate that it had been a success at a minimum, because the capture of Kherson directly may take several weeks, if not months. And that turned out to be what happened, in that they captured the northern half of the region. And then ultimately it took more than a month for the Russians to decide to withdraw. But I don't at the moment have a basis to make a similar prediction about what would be a minimum level of success for this specific spring offensive, to say that they have made enough progress that they can, rest with that amount of seized territory and be well positioned for whatever the next step is. But I would invite you guys to think about that, and whether you DM me or if you want to tell me, boy, I'd love to bring it up in a future space or add it to the thread, take any of those options. But I think these are the important things we'll need to do to evaluate the success of it. Regina, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think the best measure of success would not only be them splitting the forces, but cutting off their supplies. And I think that's going to be the aim of the next offensive, would be cutting off their supply routes into Ukraine and starving them out.
And so when you say that, are you thinking, number one, to split them? Do you think they need to capture all the way down to Melitopol, like right down to the coast?
I think they're going to go down as far as they can in order to be able to reach the supply routes in from Crimea, out from Russia into Donetsk, and they're going to go in from Kharkiv Oblast to reach the supply routes in from Russia in the north into Luhansk. And they're going to cut the 3 into supply routes that bring stuff in for the troops and starve them out.
And so by starve them out, given that supply would be coming up from Crimea, like it would be interrupted, but it had been coming up from Crimea and east to west from uh, Russia proper. The area to be starved out would be what? The northern portion of Zaporizhia Oblast, or
Yeah, they're going to stop that. There's two roads coming in from Crimea. Those the rail lines. Stop that. There is one road coming into Donetsk from Russia. That needs to be severed over the Sea of Azov. And then there's the supply route coming in from the north into Kharkiv. If they cut those three supply routes, Russia cannot get any arms or any munitions or any food into their troops. Cut those three, and they're done.
right? And so on that basis, what I'm suggesting people do is take out a map, look at one of the better mappers, do a quick search for people who are war mappers who have also highlighted the logistics main lines. What are they? Ground lines of control or ground lines of communication, and trace down from the north above the front line the routes that would likely lead to the severing of those lines, and figure out what the major towns along those lines are. That way you'll be prepared to say, oh boy, they've made this much progress, this is how much they have left to advance. And that way you'll be a little ahead of the curve, in understanding what the news means as it flows out. Wolverine, go ahead.
So the northern route, the main axis, and this is why the Ukrainians did what they did last year, was northern area that they needed to take, which was the major resupply route for the Russian army at the time, was Kupiansk. Because if you look at it, how many of the roads and stuff like that, they come into there. So the Ukrainians still control that. The next one down south was Izium. Izium was also another major area because that's where a lot of rail lines, roads, such as that came into also. The Ukrainians took that, as well as some other cities towards the east. Now, as far as coming out of Crimea, now the roads are really not the issue because the Russians primarily do not use roads as their main source of resupplying their forces. The main source of resupply is actually by rail. Now, if you look at the Kerch Bridge, the attack that happened last year, the bridge part, the road portion of it is actually going to be back up and running full scale. It's pretty soon, if not already. The rail portion, though, is the issue. And for some reason, I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it's because of how it's built or whatnot. But the bridge, the train portion is not going to be fully operational, if operational at all, like the road portion is. Well, for supplies, that was the actual main route that the Russian army was using, was across the Kerch Bridge. So you have limited the supplies that are actually coming into Ukraine from Russia. The Ukrainians have also been smart on, they're using the HIMARS to actually target command posts and ammunition areas, and concentration of troops, which is exactly what the HIMARS systems are great for because of their range. So every time, when you look at different reports, when it was coming out of mil.ua, or there's a couple other sources and stuff like that, you're always hearing that they're hitting. If you're not going to see too many command posts, but you see a lot of ammunition areas that are getting hit, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations, and that's significant because as long as they keep on hitting those ammunition storage areas, they're going to limit the capabilities of the Russian army and what they can do. And some of those areas sometimes are also doubling up, which we saw last year there was actually an ammo depot, which the Russians were stupid enough to do it, but they actually had an ammunition depot that doubled up as a fuel depot, and the Ukrainians hit that as well. So, that takes out fuel, ammunition, and then we hit the troop concentrations. Now, the good thing about hitting troop concentrations is you may not kill a lot of Russian troops, but you don't need to, because it's a psychological factor. So if, all these Russian dudes are getting popped by HIMARS every time they go into a big area, they're going to be like, oh, why am I going to do this when we're going to hit by, some type of indirect fire? So the Ukrainians, even though, they're engaged in a lot of the ground, especially, in Bakhmut and Volodar, they're still keeping some of their assets, mainly the HIMARS, sitting out there and engaging these high-value targets, basically, is what you can call them, these high-value targets on the Russian side, and they're basically taking them out any chance they can. So it's not that they're, the flow of supplies has been limited and has been slowed. It hasn't been completely stopped, but when we're looking at everything that's going on in the whole grand scheme, the Ukrainian army has severely limited the amount of munitions, food, POLs, fuel, and all that stuff. The things that they need to run combat operations, they've severely limited them. And the Russians have not done that, at least from what I've seen on the Ukrainian side. They're not able to hit a lot of the areas where the Ukrainians are at, just because of the way they're doing things. And if the U.S. has something to do with that, in regards to like how they are training them and how they do their stuff, then great on them. That means they're kind of going with the protocols and our doctrine of how we do stuff here in the United States.
Well, thanks for that detail. Yeah, so severing Russian lines and disrupting their logistics in advance is critical. People talk about have shaping operations for a Ukrainian offensive already begun. I think there's still debate about that. At the same time, and again, this is setting up a future discussion that we won't have time to get into now because we'll be wrapping up shortly. But do consider, for example, there was discussion about how the Ukrainians may begin a two-pronged offensive, in that they actually initiated the Kherson offensive before they began the Kharkiv offensive, and then the Kharkiv offensive was wildly successful, while the Kherson offensive was still, sort of gradually moving forward. And so I've even heard people say, while the Russians seem to be pushing forward on all fronts at the moment, including up around Kupiansk, which is sort of the northeastern portion of the front line, might the Ukrainians push back in more than one place at the same time? Or given that the Ukrainians had telegraphed the Kherson offensive for a very long time, and there was speculation that might have been to drive the Russian response to fortify across the river, which was tactically not a great idea, might, while there's tons of logic to driving down toward the coast, the Sea of Azov, might the Ukrainians actually initiate somewhere else first? And so they're, I just encourage people to think about those alternatives, not just to be right, but because preparing how to think about them will allow you to provide better analysis when the time comes. We'll go to Exit and then back to Wolverine. Go ahead, Exit.
Just two things I've put in the nest for everybody. There's a tweet with an article on Twitter Advanced Search, which can be really helpful when you're trying to search for specific things in Twitter, obviously. And then Wolverine, to your point, the road portion of the Kerch Bridge is open, and you'll see up there, second back in the nest is a report from Chris O about that, as well as it talks about them having to remove a portion of the rail bridge in order to be able to fix it going forward so they can open back up. And if I remember correctly, I think he said that that would take at the very least another 6 months before they expected that to occur.
Thanks for that. Go ahead, Wolverine.
So as far as like example, Kupiansk, one thing people got to think of before, and I think someone said this. I can't remember, but I love looking at maps and looking them over and stuff like that. One thing when you look at Kupiansk is you got to look at what do the Russians have to cross before they have to get to Kupiansk, and it's a river. And we have seen time and time again how the Russians have failed on river crossings, even though they say, oh, they did such a great job in Kherson and these units, but the thing is that the Ukrainians were still raining hell down on them during that whole time. So I think that if the Russians were try to cross the river, because if they try coming that far, the Ukrainians are going to blow the bridge and drop it. And then, that's going to leave the Russian forces to have to do river crossings. And I think that's going to be a detrimental to them because, like I said, we've seen time and time again where they just basically suck at it. But, when you look at stuff like that, like how supplies are and stuff like that, you need to look at, what did the Russians have to cross or what did they have to maneuver through, and stuff like that before they can actually get to the units, and stuff like that. So it's, like I said, I love reading maps, and maps can give you so much detail, so much information. And if you just kind of think about it, and sometimes like the simplest terms, well, if I take out this, what happens to, A and B and stuff like that. So, but like I said, unless the Russians can cross the river over by Kupiansk, though, I don't think they'll ever get it.
Well, let's hope that's the case. And so that issue of how to track a Ukrainian offensive, I think, still remains open. I've highlighted some of the issues to you guys. If it's the sort of thing anybody would like to discuss in a future space, maybe because you've done some work or put together some tweets that break down, keywords or city names or routes that you think are relevant, please come back to me and we'd be happy to give you, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to chat about how you're approaching it. ID10T, go ahead.
Ukraine is under extreme advisement from the West. The training on the equipment that they are receiving, yes, it's a lot of nouns, but what makes the Western military as effective as it is are the verbs. Yes, it takes nouns to fire rounds. Yes, it takes nouns, tanks, but it's how we implement it and the process in which we do so. Ukraine is putting this together. They are building their proficiency, and they are waiting for the parameters to be correct. They are not going to use a Soviet doctrine of use it or lose it. That's where the Russians are failing. They will use Western tactics with Western equipment in an assault that has been calculated to suit them the best. And that's when they will strike.
They certainly have shown every evidence of marshaling their resources wisely so far. So hopefully that they continue to, work at that standard. Gurney, go ahead. Maybe we'll take it. This is the last sort of question comment from the audience. And then I have 1 or 2 points before concluding. Go ahead, Gurney.
Yes, so I appreciate what I think Michael is sort of framing here in terms of the context of both what does an offensive look like and how can you measure it, and maybe ID10T is also nibbling around the edges here. I think some of the challenges are going to be understanding what is the maximal Ukrainian political goal at what specific time. I mean, I don't think it's far-fetched for us to assume what the maximal Ukrainian political goal is, right? That's sort of much easier to do, but to identify a point in time, say in upcoming spring, and to say, how do we not just how do we measure an offensive if it happens for some metrics, but how do we judge that in the context of not knowing particularly at that period of time what Ukraine's necessary goal is. And what I mean by that is, and I appreciate the framing of this here, is because, there's several different things that it could be. I mean, there could be the operational and military strategy. And I think, in some context, we can frame that question very narrowly and say, what does that look like? But I think there's the larger question there in terms of perhaps a military victory at a certain point of time is advantageous, or are there other overarching goals? And what I mean by that is does Ukraine have pressure does Ukraine feel pressure to perform to the West and at certain timetables? There's just a lot of considerations. So for me, I appreciate the framing of it, because it's going to be a challenge to sort of both measure it narrowly on a military ability. And what I mean by that is on a military ability, Ukraine has shown pretty good restraint at controlling OPSEC. So another challenge of actually our ability here in the OSINT crowd to discern what is happening, at real time or without delay, is going to be tough. It's going to be much tougher than it was in March of last year. So I appreciate that context. But just in terms of the larger scope too, is for us to not know what Ukraine feels is the most pressing political concern, and how to express that at what point in time. So, for instance, just a hypothetical here is, if we've put all of these eggs in a basket for an offensive, have we created conditions which Ukraine must perform? Also, if Ukraine were to view incremental progress as success, I mean, these are all different ways to base it, and I think Michael has framed that here in his question, right? So there's a lot of different ways to look at what might come. I think ultimately it'll be a challenge for our community to sort of identify that out of a very narrow operational, military type mindset, because some things might not be apparent to us in terms of if Ukraine is willing to take off a quarter of land instead of a greater audacious attempt in order to portray to the West that they can use these tools and they have used these tools. There's just a lot of concerns that I think are challenges that we can overcome. So I appreciate Michael's framing of that and just thinking of that in the future context.
You see, Gurney gets it. And I think that also by preparing in advance, when I say you can provide better analysis, that's not just to say you can predict what's going to happen, because that's hard, as Gurney outlined. It's that other people who have not prepared will start to develop analysis and put it out there, and it will not be well-founded. And if you're prepared to understand what realistic implications are, what realistic goals are, you'll be in a better position, number one, not to be fooled by it, and number two, to put forward a better alternative.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, no, I know. Sorry I wasn't able to support you, but I'm glad to see so many people here. If you haven't already, do support Michael. He's doing some wonderful work. Does co-hosting with me for some reason still, but I'm very glad he's branched out onto his own very, I think, fruitful spaces, and I look forward to seeing where they go. I mean, I'm just going to offer a couple of broader things because I haven't the awareness of what you guys have discussed intricately. What I would say is, Gurney's points just made me think of a couple of things, right? So understanding Bakhmut from a more sort of broader overview is that this war is continuously one of information warfare, and I know that's obvious, but when we're talking about particularly unfortunate setbacks like this one seemingly is or will be for the Ukrainian side, they're notoriously going to be opaque with the information that they give to the public. And this is where you can see, unfortunately, people who have it in for the Ukrainian side, a lot of the Russian aligned, as I'm calling them from now on, entities on this app alone, who for some reason have, this desire to just say that Russia's the best thing in the West, et cetera, et cetera. And so they will use opportunities like Bakhmut, where the limited amount of information that the Ukrainians are providing, to be like, oh, well, there's a bunch of nefarious reasons, or the Ukrainians are actually bad actors as much as the Russians, right? You'll see some opportunistic pundits and commentators jump on the bandwagon of bashing Ukraine because it's sort of not being as transparent. You know, if they want to be taken as the morally superior force or side in this power, then they will, you know, they should be for some reason releasing all the information, not understanding that in the fog of war you need to sometimes be deliberately opaque. So that is a be it in, you know, other theatres of war in, say, Syria and so on. And that leads me to my other point, which is, again, as always, I emphasise the political element in this. It's important to consider always and talk about the tactical level, but for me, the military-political relationship is equally of value, because just in the past day, Sergei Lavrov has been discussing the war in India and the way that the foreign minister of the adversary in this war talks carries weight. And if he's talking about Bakhmut in such a way, that's going to carry weight with people on the battlefield, right? If you can continue to get in the minds of people from the diplomatic level, or even sway the minds of diplomatic observers, right? That can have implications indirectly or even directly on the battlefield. So, just for example, right? So Lavrov, in his delightfully boorish of a man way, was having a sort of, I don't know if you call it a debate, but he was like being interviewed on a panel on a stage somewhere in India, and he was getting quite. I've watched the video a few times. You know, India's meant to be neutral, and largely speaking, they follow this line. But what I noticed was quite a lot of laughter and sort of almost sort of levity in the auditorium, right? And Lavros does the great. He got a lot of applause for the whataboutisms of the West with Serbia. He mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq, and you know. He would often sort of basically just pivot away or dominate, and he reiterated all the same things. And the point I'm getting at is this: that if he can sway an audience of senior delegates in an Indian supposedly neutral nation, what implications does that have for the psychological, you know, part of the war?
Was that the same interview where he said that like Ukraine attacked us and he got laughed at loudly? Is that the same interview in New Delhi?
Quite possibly. Yeah, I think it was. Again, you know, and that's the thing. So I was watching thank you for bringing that up, because the video I was referencing was a Russian produced one. So the Russians produced, you know, a highlights reel of all the best bits, and they conveniently overlooked that bit. So anyway, bottom point is that I think these sorts of things can play into the psyche quite a lot. So that's all I really wanted to add. But thanks for the space, Michael.
Of course. And so just as we wrap up, I'm just going to do plugs for everybody. And Piotr, I know you have interviews coming up with Wesley Clark, former U.S. general, and you also are going to have a...
So I've been in touch with General Wesley Clark. If you're not familiar with him, listeners, he was the he was the commanding of the NATO in Europe, and oversaw Operation Blast. So he overlooked Operation Allied Force during the Kosovo War. So he was the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO from 1997 to 2000, and has done quite a lot of related things. So I've been in touch with him, and we've also got Svetlana. I'm not going to say her name because I'll piss off Jakubi, but she's the People's Republic. I've got a few things. I'm mainly in transition at the moment. I'm back in DC next week and have bought some proper equipment. So I'm actually going to be trying to take this video casting YouTube thing a little bit more seriously than just sort of doing it in my hallway or wherever my Wi-Fi is most stable. So we'll have more of a regular fixture next week, and you know, co-streaming Twitter Spaces, co-streaming YouTube, and I am going to Spaces. So like this one, but maybe just of this. So if you're interested in the way diplomacy plays into the military or geopolitics more broadly, then well, come and join the spaces, and you'll see Michael and lots of fun faces. But yeah, sorry, Michael, I didn't mean to interject, but I just wanted to get the Operation Allied Force correct.
Yeah, no problem. I was setting you up because I'll probably be co-hosting some of those interviews with you if we can set that up. A funny story. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya's what is it? Is nay Pilipchuk. So her maiden name is Pilipchuk, which is a missed opportunity for a simpler to pronounce name. So every time it comes up,
say that ain't easy, to be honest, either.
Okay.
Well, just always, I just learned it. I learned it from your Twitter feed, Piotr. It always takes 2 to tango. So it's good to have friends like Michael Bond.
So in any event, if you enjoy conversations like this, there is another space tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. It's hosted by Aaron. There's a link to that up in the nest if you would like to come back and chat some more with people. I will be holding another space next Thursday at 9, and then again a week from now, Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. So please do come back and check that out. We'll revisit some of these ongoing stories, whether it be the Black Sea Grand Initiative or the Turkish elections, or how to plan for a coming Ukrainian offensive. I'd like to give a big thank you to everybody who contributed by speaking in the space today, including big friends of the channel. I'd like to thank my co-host particularly because I had some mic trouble for about 15 or 20 minutes in the middle there, and they carried the conversation very admirably. And we had a great chat with Andrew Perpetua. In case you missed that early part of the conversation, the recording will be here, and you can check it out afterwards. As well, portions of our conversation, if not the whole thing, I think may have been streamed to YouTube by friends of the channel who are trying to get some of the content out by that method as well. And so, have a look at these speakers who are up here with me and Andrew Perpetua. And if you don't follow them, I think they're terrific sources of information and would encourage you to do that. In any event, thank you very much. And I hope that you join us again soon.